hallmark of the city of Minot and its residents. And whereas these volunteers' efforts to serve and strengthen our community by reminding all of us that we can help make Minot a better place to live, work, and play through the power of volunteerism. Whereas businesses in Minot have continually responded to the needs of our community and our residents by allowing and encouraging their employees to take part in the annual Magic Day of Giving, and whereas the residents of Minot have eagerly worked together with the organizers of the Magic Day of Giving to make this annual event a successful event by donating their time and to help others within the community. I do realize we are past the day of the 13th, but therefore do I, Sean Sitma, the mayor of Minot, hereby proclaim September 13th, 2019 as the Magic Day of Giving in Minot. And I do want to commend all of the volunteers and all of the organizers for helping put together a great event and continue to march forward with a great event. And I think we did get some pretty nice new spray paint or paint rather, on a lot of our different fire hydrants throughout the city, among other projects. So, Jessica, thank you so much. And
thank you.
Appreciate you being here so that we can help further, I think, encourage people in the volunteerism in our community. Thank you. All right, back on to schedule our consent items. Item number 3 on our agenda. Alderman Janser.
Mr. Mayor, I'd move consent items 3.1 to 3.9.
Second.
We have a motion by Alderman Janser, second by Alderman Olson. Any items that need to be pulled or for consideration by any alderman? Alderman Walski?
Mayor Sim, I maybe have just a brief question if it can be answered. I don't think I would need to pull the item. It would be regarding the leases of T-hangers 8 and 12.
I think we should probably just pull 3.6
Okay.
And vote on the rest. Any discussion on the motion or any other items that need to be pulled? Any discussion? Please call the roll.
Janser,
Yes.
Olson,
Yes.
Pittner,
Yes.
Padragula,
Yes.
Straight,
Yes.
Wolski, Sitma.
Yes, motion is approved. 3.6 is the assignment of lease on the T-hangers number 8 and T-hangers number 12. The recommendation approval of the airport T-hanger lease between the City of Minot and the M20K LLC, care of the William Quam, and the T-hanger number 8 for $75 per month. Recommendation is for approval of the airport T-hanger lease between the City of Minot and Jay Blessum for the T-hanger number 12 for $75 a month, and authorize the mayor to sign the agreement.
So moved.
Motion by Alderman Walski, second by Alderman Pittner. Discussion.
Mr. Mayor, I just wanted to confirm that this has, these hangars are not the same hangars in which we have a discussion item on later.
I would look to our airport director if we could. Good evening.
Good evening, Mr. Mayor. Alderman Walski, that is correct. These are the city-owned T-hangars, not the land leases that are on the agenda for later.
Okay. Thanks, sir. Further question? Okay. Further discussion? Please call the roll.
Wolski,
Yes.
Sitma,
Yes.
Janser,
Yes.
Olson, Pittner,
Yes.
Padragula,
Yes.
Straight.
Yes.
Motion is approved. That takes us to our action items on our agenda. The public hearing for the proposed 2020 budget. We have had several different community input meetings and city council meetings. I'm sorry, not community input meetings, but city council meetings and information opportunities. And tonight is the public hearing for the 2020 budget. So this is an opportunity from folks within the audience to come forward and speak their mind about the budget, speak for or against any proposed items that they may see within our budget that is before us. And as always, if you would, name and affiliation or address for the record.
My name is Aaron Moss. I'm the president of the Fraternal Order of Police, Souris Valley Regional Lodge Number 7. Just a little background on our organization. We are the largest law enforcement officer representation organization in the country, with about 347,000 members, gaining 30,000 in the last year. We are one of 2,200 lodges with about 150 law enforcement officers, correctional officers, dispatchers from federal, state, county, and city agencies throughout the region, 50 of which are employed right here at the city of Minot. I speak tonight in support of the budget as submitted by Council President Jansen in the last meeting. As it's written, we believe this budget recognizes the highest priorities and responsibilities to the public that you and we serve, specifically funding priorities in public safety and critical infrastructure, and then economic development in that order. For our membership, this is chiefly evident in a fully funded pay plan for the city staff. Continuing this funding priority as it was in the last budget shows this council's commitment to retaining trained and experienced staff. And in doing so, that helps ensure a continuity of service when it comes to policing services to this community. While we always believe there's additional room for improvement, we are pleased with this budget's pay plan and shows respect for the efforts our members put forth when others have been less so in history. So this dedication by protecting your staff's pay and benefits directly impacts worker satisfaction and in turn improves retention, which has been a stated goal over the past couple budget cycles, and we recognize and appreciate your efforts in that regard. We're particularly impressed with this budget's ability to fund critical projects and public safety priorities with the projected spending increases without a property tax increase, or more importantly, a decrease in benefits to our members' benefits packages. So this is a testament to this body's commitment to strong advocacy for the Magic City and when seeking critical funding from other available resources. So we'll just close by thanking you for your time and encourage a yes vote on the proposed budget. And with that, I'll stand for any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Moss. Any questions for the officer tonight?
Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Moss. Good to see some of our men and women in blue as well here. And Shields, I will say that I just, in somewhat related, we spent some time at Minot Central Campus here recently, where we did have a little increase in our presence within the Minot Police Department. I was happy to see that so many of the officers were there and the kids' minds were put at ease because of the presence there, so thank you. At this time, I would encourage anyone else to come forward for any other statements or questions within our proposed 2020 budget.
My name is Mike Enslin, 1714 Fifth Avenue, Southwest Minot. I guess I'm representing the silent majority of the taxpayers in Minot. My taxes in the last 2 years have went up approximately 48%. And what I'm trying to let you council members know is that the majority of people in this town are up to here with taxes. People are moving out. My neighbor's selling his house because he can't afford the taxes anymore. And I live in the flood zone. Some of you do maybe. And not only do we have to pay our insurance on our house, we have to pay flood insurance, which is going up every year. So what I'm asking you is that I know this 2020 budget's probably going to pass tonight, and there's probably nothing that any of the taxpayers can do, but there's a lot of people in town, the vast majority I talk to, think that Minot should tighten their belts. See where you can find places to cut spending and not increase spending by buying things that you don't necessarily need, but you want. I'd like to buy things that I want too, but I can only afford to buy things I need. So I'm asking you from the taxpayers of Minot to consider that in your discussions in the future about the budget. I'm sure there's nothing going to be done tonight but a vote of yes on the budget. So I'm looking for the future. Maybe my taxes won't go up again. But in 2 years, 48% is a lot of money. So I appreciate you guys looking into that and taking that into consideration. And I want to thank these police officers for all their things. And I think maybe the police officers should be increased, because this isn't Sleepy Hollow anymore. So I think maybe we should get some more manning that they deserve, and I thank you guys from the bottom of my heart.
Thank you, Mr. Ensland.
Any questions for me? I'm sorry.
Any questions? Thank you, sir.
Okay.
I will again extend the opportunity for folks to come forward and ask questions or make comments as well for the proposed 2020 budget. I'm sitting patiently. I will ask one more time before I look to the council. Any further comments on the proposed 2020 budget? If not, I would look to the council for a motion. Alderman Janser.
Mr. Mayor, I move we adopt the budget ordinance on first reading.
Can we first start with closing the public hearing and
Oh,
then?
I'm sorry, yeah.
Yep.
Close the public hearing and adopt the budget.
Motion by Alderman Janser, second by Alderman Pittner. Discussion on the motion. Oh, Alderman Walsky.
Yeah, I've got a couple amendments that I'm going to introduce here, but before I get into that, I would request Mr. Lakefield come up. There's a line on page 85 where I think we discovered some new information maybe in the last couple days, and I want to get an update on Hub City funding that we're still expecting for yet in 2019. Not directly attached to this particular budget, but revenue that may have a bearing on it.
Good evening, Mr. Lakefield. I think we are looking at page 85 of our budget.
And for reference, I am looking at the economic development line, which is $122,000, and I'm also looking at the transfer to the general fund, which is $177,000 roughly. They're towards the top in the economic development.
Mr. Mayor, members of the council, that money is money that the council has set aside for City of Minot economic development efforts. The anticipation is, and the city is currently working with a recruiting firm to fill that position that was authorized in the 2019 budget. The general fund transfer is the transfer to the planning and community development department to cover the salary, benefits, equipment, and any expenses associated with that position. The remainder that is still in economic development, the 122, 330, is the seed money for the city's revolving loan fund that was approved last year.
Okay. I appreciate that explanation, Mr. Lakefield. I guess the seed money for the revolving loan fund was new to me. It was my assumption that that was the second half of the $250,000 that had been allocated last year for the economic development. Because according to this particular budget here, what we're showing is that the $250,000 we allocated last year for the economic development position didn't make it into this version.
Mr. Mayor, Alderman Wolski, and I should back up a little bit. The remainder of the money is for the city's economic development efforts, and one of the things that was anticipated with that was the development of a nonprofit with a revolving loan fund. So that was one of the activities that was discussed. And you're correct in our discussions earlier. This was something that was brought as an amendment in last year's budget process, and with all the changes that took place, it was overlooked in the final adoption of the budget. So what had happened is when that was discovered after the adoption of the budget, we brought forth a budget amendment to correct that in the 2019 budget. That's why it doesn't show up in the comparables here. It was included as an ongoing appropriation in this year's budget. However, like our discussions that we had the other day, Alderman Wolski, this is the appropriation to spend that money in this year. So, for example, in the 2019 appropriation, if that money is not expended by the end of the year, that will revert back into the fund balance for economic development. And that appropriation will expire, for the lack of a better term, unless there's some mechanism to encumber those funds, like a contract that is in place or something like that. It would remain in fund balance, so it would be available to be appropriated in future years for that purpose.
And then Dave, a quick update on Hub City revenue that we expect potentially in 2019. Again, estimates as best we can provide them.
Mr. Mayor, Alderman Wolski, I think in some of the conversations that we've had earlier in the year, the estimate for the 2020 budget cycle is about a $3 million increase in Hub City funding. And I think the initial assumption was that that went into effect in July 1, so we would see essentially half of that amount in the 2019 budget that was not budgeted for. However, due to the delays in how that tax money is paid through to us, we haven't seen any of that increased funding yet. We're anticipating that that would actually come online here later in September when we get the September payment. So, you know, if we do the math, half of 3 million, we would have expected 1.5 million in 2019. It's probably going to be more in the order of like 900,000 because we'll only collect that increased funding for 4 of the 6 months.
One more follow-up, Mr. Mayor.
Yes, please continue.
Mr. Lakefield, in our discussions on Friday, you also mentioned that out of this particular 2020 budget, approximately 150,000 of that 900 is lightly earmarked towards some capital improvement projects. Is that roughly correct? If I didn't get the exact earmark right, it's about 150,000, I think we talked about being encumbered.
Mr. Mayor and Alderman Wolski, I think I've lost track of you here because what we had budgeted originally in 2019 has been accounted for. The additional money, I think we're expecting, okay, I'm doing the math here. I think we're expecting a total of about 6.28 million, and we're budgeting to spend 6.43 million. So yeah, that would be in anticipation of having some fund balance. Now, we have some money typically that, you know, we budget on a forecast and we try to get that as close as we can, but we obviously don't want to overshoot our expectations. So typically we do have a little bit of money at the end of the year that has not been appropriated that is available for appropriation in the following year.
Okay.
Thank you, Alderman
Yep.
Wolski.
I just kind of wanted to help establish a couple sources of funds there.
And Alderman Straight here in just a moment. Just for the audience, both here and at home, also with the Hub City funding, this is essentially a forecast model, as Mr. Lakefield had indicated, based on an approximation, if I'm not mistaken, of $55 a barrel for sweet crude. On how this was drawn up in the state legislature, and $52.50. And anything below that would actually affect our revenue source coming in. Anything above that would obviously also affect it on the other side. So this is, I think, at our best guess based on legislative models on dollars that we would anticipate, but clearly this is impacted by the economics within the production here in North Dakota. So Alderman Straight.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Dave, while you're up there, can you, I want to talk a little bit about NAS, since that's one of the largest projects that we have to fund. Can you remind the public of how much money we currently have in reserves that we've been accumulating over the last number of years while NAS has been tied up in lawsuits?
Mr. Mayor, Alderman Straight, off the top of my head, I think we're sitting on about $18 million that we have on hand or that we expect to collect. We are anticipating that we are going to be short going forward. That is why we had implemented or reallocated some of the second penny sales tax towards NAS here. I believe it was last year.
Sure.
And we're anticipating it's going to take 4 to 5 more years of collections to get enough money built up. I think we're estimating about $45 million total to complete it. So somewhere around 4 to 5 years.
Mr. Mayor, if I could, I just wanted to follow up, Dave, because I had a conversation with Mr. Bob Schemp last week, and I believe he maybe had spoken with you and also with City Manager Barry, and I've kind of looked at the numbers that he has conveyed, and it's just to be clear, because sometimes I think we talk about these numbers so much I get confused. The biota plant that's going to need to be funded is going to be paid for by the state and reimbursed by the federal government. So our local share is not going to go towards that project, correct?
Mr. Mayor, Alderman Straight, that is the assumption at this point.
Okay. And I know that we have these assumptions because we have to look at our numbers, but what concerns me a little bit is I think we have a difference in what the need is for the project in relation. There's an idea that we might only need up to $25 to $30 million compared to what you're saying in terms of $40 million. And I think as we move forward, because we have to reallocate this portion of the second penny back to it, it's City Manager Barry, I think it's going to be very important that we keep the public updated on this, because I think that those dollars, the public is very interested to know when we're going to take care of the obligation, but when that fund is going to revert back to that second penny. And so when we talk about 2.5 to 4 years and that difference, it's very important to the public because as the gentleman said prior, we have to be very mindful of all the funds in terms of the property taxes. And so I think this is an important piece that I want us to be very alert to.
Thank you, Alderman Straight. City Manager Barry.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Alderman Straight, I think it's absolutely important what you've just said. Just for clarification, the roughly $43 million that's needed to finish the project is inclusive of the $18 million or so that we have in reserves already. So that's where you get to the $25 million difference of additional funds needed. And that backs into essentially the projection of about $4 million per year for the next 4 or 5 years or so. All that math is kind of what we're running in the background to ensure that by the 2022-2023 timeframe, we're essentially done with having to raise money through sales taxes for NAWS. And what's nice about that is that frees that money up for other things, whether it be flood control or something else the council should choose to decide to finance with that funding at that time.
Further questions for our City Finance Director as he is at the podium? Thank you, Mr. Lakefield. Further discussion on the proposed 2020 budget from the Alderman. Alderman Walski.
Mayor Simma, thank you. Like I said, I wanted to call Mr. Lakefield up to get kind of a sense of where a couple lines are at based on past actions of the council. And that explanation is directly related to an amendment I'm going to offer. But if we look at these two lines in economic development, 465.12-00 for $122,000 and 491.300 transfer the general fund for $177,000, and then we subtract out $50,000, which we typically transfer the same as we would have done in 2019 to the general fund. We have that $250,000 that we allocated last year. And so the economic development position is being collected here in 2019. And what we have here, in essence, is a second $250,000 allocation. I don't know to what degree the council wants to continue advancing that $250,000 on an annual basis, but I'm going to offer an amendment here to continue that reappropriation to economic development, but I'm going to give it a bit of a more, or I'm going to offer a bit more specific earmark. So with that in mind, I would offer to amend the 2020 budget by reducing lines 491.30-00 and 465.12-00 each to $50,000. So we go from the current earmark down to $50,000. The second part of this would be that we appropriate $200,000 in a new line to the Downtown Business and Professional Association. The fourth part of this, or the third part, I guess I wrote those two lines a little separately, would be to take our 2019 dollars that we have been collecting this year and encumber them to the economic development position that we have previously authorized. So I offer that amendment.
We have a motion to amend. Is there a second?
I'll second for the discussion.
A second by Alderman Straight. Alderman Walski.
Sure, Mr. Mayor, like I said, this is $250,000 that we are setting aside for economic development. I feel like with the $250,000 we allocated last year, we have secured approximately 3 years of funding for our economic development specialist. I think we have an identified need in downtown through both the work of the IEDC report. We have a recently completed downtown strategy plan that has identified a needed capacity in the downtown area. The Downtown Association simply doesn't have the means right now to fund a full-time employee. I believe we also all got a request from the Downtown Business Association suggesting that this is a identified need of theirs. They have made a formal request to the council and the mayor on this behalf. And then I would also point out the fact that over the past 5 years, I think we have, as a city, have invested between 25 and 30 million on infrastructure. We are proposing another significant investment on the gathering space. We are proposing another very significant investment on 3rd Street. There are other downtown-related infrastructure projects in the works. With the considerable amount of money we're spending on infrastructure, I think it would also be prudent to support that area of town with some professional staff. And I think the Downtown Professional Association is the right vehicle to deliver that.
Further discussion on the amendment? Any further discussion on the amendment? Alderman Straight.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I appreciate Alderman Walski's sentiment. I differ a little bit in terms of the funding mechanism of, or maybe it's just the dollar amount. I think that we've had some additional organizations that have stepped up. Visit Minot comes to mind, bringing forth the One Brand campaign as well as Souris Basin Planning Council. And so I would cordially like to ask my friend across the aisle if he could reconsider and possibly reapportion funds to these additional organizations that have also been leaning in and doing some more work.
Further discussion? Alderman Janser.
Like Alderman Straight, I appreciate the sentiment involved in this amendment. However, I am not tonight convinced that this is a prudent expenditure given the current structure of the organization, and I have not seen enough of a plan of how this money, and if it's spent on a salary, how that individual is going to produce the results that we're probably all looking for. So I'm not prepared to support this tonight.
I think on my perspective of this, having a discussion actually with the president of the Downtown Business Association from today, looking at exactly the information that was emailed to us, this does differ from their request in many other of the requests, whether it be from grants or other organizations that have looked for funding. With this, we would, if we're allocating at this point, there is no contract, there is no deliverables, no benchmarks to be received, as well as matching funds in this circumstance. Did go into quite a bit of detail with the president from the Downtown Business Association of steps to move forward in potential requests. I look at this point as premature. We would have the ability down the road to have, I think, a full and more in-depth discussion on some potential opportunities down the road. But I won't support the amendment tonight. City Finance Director.
Mr. Mayor, thank you. I just wanted to clarify that if the transfer to general fund was reduced or eliminated, that would eliminate the funding for the city economic development position that would be in the Planning and Community Development Department. So if this appropriation, or if that line item is reduced from the 2020 budget, there would not be an appropriation to fund that position in 2020. What would be possibly more appropriate would be to take that money from the fund reserves and appropriate it for spending. Otherwise, we are going to potentially hire this person here in the fourth quarter of 2019 and then not have the money appropriated to maintain that position in 2020.
Further discussion, Alderman Walsky.
Mr. Mayor, just as an explanation, that was essentially the final part of this motion was that we take the 2019 dollars that we have collected and encumber them towards that particular purpose. So it would essentially just be a budget year swap that was proposed. Because we have collected the 250, or in the process of collecting the initial 250,000 in this year's budget, which we did decide to do last year at this time.
Mr. Mayor and Alderman Wolski, the more appropriate way to approach this would be to increase the appropriation for the 2020 budget, utilizing reserves that we are anticipating from the 2019. We have to have the amount appropriated in the budget to be able to spend those dollars. So if we reduce one and move that money in the 2020 budget, we have to cut that spending. We are not able to encumber those unspent dollars because we don't have a contract. It's an ongoing appropriation. So we would have to come back and budget that money again in the future. So essentially to accommodate that, what we would want to do is use those reserve dollars and increase the appropriation to accommodate that position.
Sure. Mr. Mayor, I'll follow up here.
Just for a quick clarification,
Dave-
prior to, please, Mr. Walsky, and we cannot increase the mill levy at this point, correct? We would have to draw it down from somewhere else, out of a reserve allocation from another line item, out of here tonight, correct?
Mr. Mayor, that is correct.
Thank you. Alderman Walsky.
Sure. So the spirit of this motion is fairly clear. Were it to be successful tonight, would this be able to be addressed through a budget amendment at a later date to more appropriately capture the will of the motion as well as the legal accounting?
Mr. Mayor, Alderman Wolski, that's always a possibility that can be done in the future. Right now, it is eliminating the funding for that position. And I'm just thinking ahead to our recruitment efforts. It's been a difficult position to fill and probably will be very difficult to fill that position if we don't have the money appropriated in the 2020 budget. So I think that's a risk that we have. I think we're at a crossroads here where we have to make a decision if we're going to be committed to that position for the fourth quarter of 2019 and in the 2020 appropriation as well. But it is always possible that could be accomplished through a budget amendment.
Alderman Straight.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I appreciate Dave's statement because I think the public, and I've been waiting anxiously to see if somebody was going to fill this position because increasingly I'm uncomfortable with the idea that we are going to hire someone, and I mean no disrespect to any of our staff, especially the people in uniform here tonight, but when we are looking at the pay plan increases that we are probably going to approve this evening, putting another staff member that would also then be earning those benefits without having that position lined out in terms of what those deliverables are back to the public, I have great concern. And so as a result, I think if we don't fill that position soon, we should consider a budget amendment to reallocate those funds and maybe let the private sector do the work and allow the city just to run the city staff without some of the economic development pieces.
For clarification on our current situation, the city manager and staff and I did meet with a consultant this past week, as well as other members from the community, including the Chamber of Commerce and MADC as well, to draw up more definitives on exactly what this person is looking like. It would be exceptionally premature to already pull the plug on this when we really haven't even gotten out of the gates on looking as we are continuing down this process from our initial get-go in 2019. Further questions for Mr. Lakefield regarding this motion to amend? Further comments? Alderman Walsky.
Mr. Mayor, I'll speak to just a couple things that have come out in the discussion here. So first of all, this is not a motion to pull the plug on the economic development position. This is simply an acknowledgement that the dollars are there in 2019. I would fully accept that we have to appropriate them in 2020, but but I have offered a motion which has, I would say, intent to honor last year's commitment and honor funding the position of the IEDs, of the internal economic developer, but also to, for 2020, take the next step, which is advance the interests and the other goals that have been identified over the last year and a half and through the IEDC work. I would also suggest that, yes, this is indeed a different funding vehicle than what was proposed by the Downtown Association. That was at my own interest because, frankly, I thought the economic development dollars out of sales tax were more appropriate than the HUD City funding. I do realize that obviously there are details yet to be worked out, but this is not an award of dollars. We are not writing a check. We are appropriating dollars with intent to be used. My expectation would be that the fact that if this were successful, the work would get started very quickly on writing the terms of that contract, on writing the expectations of the city, out of making the agreement. We do this on a number of times with other particular organizations, and I don't think we have to reinvent the wheel here. I think this is just a signal of our intent to continue the work in the downtown arena, and I think it's appropriate to make the commitment. The Downtown Association did suggest that this was over 3 years. That would be my intent too. We're appropriating it all, but I think it could easily be earmarked and held until such time when the Downtown Association had fulfilled some of those commitments.
We recently went through an excessive exercise with Visit Minot for the allocation of Magic Fund dollars, with contracts, deliverables, and many benchmarks. I feel very uncomfortable at this point looking at this as merely premature. I think a deeper discussion has to be held. It's not that I disagree that there's potential down the road, but given the nature of just an allocation without any of this, there are many different ways to address this in even the near term. But I think we need to have a deeper discussion with the president of the downtown business professionals prior to allocating a significant amount of money. Further discussion. Last chance, further discussion. This is a motion to amend, and I suppose I could read this into great detail.
He probably would be better at it.
Alderman Wolski.
I'll capture it. It's to change the two lines previously mentioned, reduce them to $50,000 apiece, and appropriate $200,000 to the DBPA, and encumber the 2019 funds for the economic development position that we created last year.
Are we clear on the motion to amend? If we are, please call the roll.
Wolski?
Yes.
Sitma?
No.
Janser?
No.
Olson?
No.
Pittner?
No.
Padragula?
No.
Straight?
Yes.
Motion fails. Further discussion on
Yes.
the motion. Alderman Wolski.
Mr. Mayor, another brief amendment here. We'll stick on the same line, 465.12-00 economic development. It's $122,330. I would move that we reduce that by $3,000 and add an earmark for Renaissance Zone marketing.
Second.
We have a motion and a second to transfer $3,000 out of the line that is 491.32-11 from 122.30, subtracting $3 and adding an additional line for Renaissance Zone marketing. Alderman Wolski, if you would just elaborate on
Sure.
the details.
I am a member of the Renaissance Zone. We have been going through the redevelopment of our larger guiding document, which is our development plan. One of the elements in that plan that has been discovered is that the Renaissance Zone has a responsibility to market the zone, but we do not have an appropriation to do that. And so what exists in essence is an unfunded mandate. We are asked to do this particular action, but we have no resources to do it. So this has been discovered over the past year. I thought it appropriate to address that oversight by adding a modest amount that allows the organization or the board to begin work towards marketing the Renaissance Zone.
Alderman Wolski, would it be conceivable that within the economic development position that we are hiring, that would fall within part of the job duties as his work through economic development within, I guess, the outlines of which he's being hired.
I don't recall if I saw that in the job description of that particular position, Mr. Mayor. At the same time, I don't feel like a staff position is directly responsible for that isn't answerable to that particular board in any way is the right way to do this. This board has a responsibility. It is outlined in the guiding document. I think it's like I said, I think it's a position, it's a responsibility that requires resources.
City Manager Barry.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Alderman Wolski, I might have a easier way for you to get what you'd like out of this. We have spent considerable time talking with MADC as it relates to marketing and their requirements for marketing. One of the concerns that has been apparent to us over the years is a decrease in their marketing budget, so I would prefer to keep that intact if possible. I think we can get you what you're looking for in the city's component of the economic development allotment. Keep in mind, we were just talking about the $250,000 that was set up by the city council last year. Of that $250,000, roughly about $165,000 would need to be associated directly to the position, the economic development specialist, now called administrator position, for salary and benefits, and that leaves the difference between that $165,000 and $250,000 for other operational activities. And if you so directed that staff member to associate those operational monies to marketing for the Renaissance Zone, I think you could get exactly where you wanted without having to make adjustments in the budget, just as an alternative.
Mr. Barry, I guess there are elements of that I do follow, but I do want to make a correction in the sense that I feel like the assumption was that this particular $3,000 was coming from the MADC line. It was not. It was intended to be coming from the $122,000 3.30, which I think is essentially that extra economic development pot that you were just speaking of.
Sure.
So it's really just a matter of appropriating the dollars at this particular point or appropriating that at another point through a council action at that time, as I see it.
Continue, Mr.
Yes,
Barry.
thank you, Mr. Mayor. The economic development dollars do go toward MADC, and they go to MADC in different components, some of it through contractual arrangements with MADC, some of it through marketing, and some of it to the Magic Fund, which they administer on the city's behalf, essentially. So I think we can get I think the money's there. I think if you directed me or the staff, for that matter, to include as part of our activities Renaissance Zone marketing, we could get you where you need to go without having to make any adjustments to the budget. But if you'd feel more comfortable to do that, I'm just posing that again as an alternative. Certainly, it is work that is germane to that particular line item and does afford us flexibility for the type of activities you're mentioning.
City Manager Barry, Alderman Wolski, I guess rest of the staff as well. I look at this as if we do take a look at that economic development budget that we have developed, that does include the activities of marketing within that allocation that exists within the budget. I would assume that would not only be the Renaissance Zone, but the Opportunity Zone that is also in the downtown, as well as the Pace Flex program that we're going to be also working through and also collaborating with the Bank of North Dakota, MADC in circumstances. I think that's where I'm looking at this, is that already exists within that economic development budget, because it will be a component of the different tools in the toolbox that exists for the city.
Mr. Mayor, I would suggest that none of that's any different than it was last year or the year before or the year before. This has always been an element of economic development. It simply hasn't been funded. It hasn't been prioritized. And so that's why I'm bringing it up here as a specific item, because I want it prioritized. I want it lined out. That's why it was offered as an amendment.
Mr. Mayor?
Further discussion, Alderman Olson.
My question would be for Alderman Wolski. Why $3,000? Is this based on a bid or a discussion related to marketing? I know, where did the number 3,000 come from?
Alderman Olson, it's a great question. It's come out of rough discussions at our meetings with the Renaissance Zone. There's an acknowledgement that we need to market the zone. We have projects taking place, getting underway even now, that we have individuals who are not aware that the zone exists, not aware that there are opportunities there. And we simply feel like we need resources to better spread the word. And so this was a number that there hasn't been a formal motion or a formal request, but it has come up in general discussions, and this amount seemed like an appropriate and reasonable ask.
Further discussion? Further discussion on the motion to amend? Motion to amend includes taking $3,000 from the line of $122,300 from the transfer, I'm sorry, is that the economic development?
465.12-00, economic development.
Removing $3,000 into a separate line item specific to Renaissance Zone marketing. Please call the roll.
Wolski?
Yes.
Sitma?
No.
Dancer?
No.
Olson?
No.
Pittner?
No.
Padragula?
No.
Straight?
Yes.
Motion fails. Further discussion on the motion before us on the 2020 budget. Alderman Straight.
Mr. Mayor, I'm going to just pull something for a discussion for you all. I meant to get it to you in writing this past week, but I failed because I left town to go and be with my mother who was having surgery. So I just want to talk about page 14. I'm wrong. Hold on one second. Let me make sure I get my right page. And it has to do, and I wanted to notify the public because you're all here tonight, and if you're not paying attention, you might not be aware, but there's a budget item, a line item, that we, as the city council, as your elected officials, will get a pay increase. And I want to bring it to your attention tonight. It's not an astronomical pay increase. We're still going to be the lowest paid city council in the state. But I'm going to raise the issue in the next month that the pay increase is going to go from $500 to $1,000. And the reason I'm supporting it tonight, and I'm going to talk about it in the future, is I want to have a public discussion about term limits. And with my council members tonight, I just want you to think about it. I'm going to be promoting an idea that after 2 terms, regardless if you're a council member or the mayor, you have to step aside for a term. It's happening across the state in other areas. And I think it, in my eyes, it adds to building a little more public trust for this office and for the community, and it puts the onus on the taxpayer to be more involved. I know some people agree with term limits and don't, but I'm going to frame it out tonight under having the mass public here. It's something that's important to me, and I'll frame it out under I'm not running next year in 2020. And I'm not running because I've served 2 terms. It's only been 4 terms, but it's as a result of our Make Minot campaign. I just think it's healthy for our democracy if we have people that will step up and get involved, and I don't think the current pay will allow that. So I just wanted to speak to that tonight, Mr. Mayor. I'm not asking for any change in the budget. I'm just pointing it out to the public in all transparency that I want to hear from them because it matters to me, and I think we're all passionate about this community, and this is something that I think, I hope I'm certain it'll make it in the paper and it'll spur some conversation. But I just wanted to be transparent with the public because it wasn't and hasn't been brought up. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Alderman Wolski. Very good point, or Straight, sorry.
That's all right. I understand.
Very good point. I think with that, also, I would look to our city manager, as we had discussed, as we were contemplating this, looking towards not only the next election cycle and looking for the perspectives of what we would anticipate folks that we would hope would step forward, but also within the surveys that were done. If you could, Mr. City Manager, just elaborate at a high level on the pay plan when it came to the elected leadership that has gone well more than a decade or maybe even 2 without addressing this.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. The council salaries were evaluated using the same methodology that the city employees' salaries are evaluated on a annual basis. Essentially, as you may recall, 1/3 of the city's positions are benchmarked against other cities and private sector positions and so on and so forth. And all of that is described in our annual pay plan. And essentially, our attempt is to try to keep pace with salaries to ensure that we are competitive so that we can remain fully employable, if you will. And the City Council in years and years and years past has decided not to include their positions in that salary survey, and so they had not been included. When I looked at the data and found the excursion to be greater than 50%, I felt it was time to bring that to the City Council's attention. There are a lot of sacrifices that you make as a City Council, and in particular, now that we have a 7-member council instead of 15, there are even more duties that this council engages in, more meetings, and the like. So it felt appropriate to bring to your attention that there was a great disparity, in fact, the largest disparity of all the positions evaluated this year, and to make some adjustments. The council has been diligent about making sure that there was reason applied, that there was logic applied, and that certainly that no one was profiting essentially from serving as an elected official. And we've been able to meet all of those goals, I believe. But the process is very, what I want to say, it's the approach that was taken is a best management practice for evaluating positions, and that same practice was used for council members as, again, was used for city staff members. So hopefully that helps a little bit.
Alderman Straight.
Mr. Sitma, not to, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just for the public, we do not receive health benefits. This is just a pay increase that I hope will spur some folks to possibly run for city council. And in final, I mean absolutely no disrespect to my colleagues who have served multiple terms or have come back. It has absolutely nothing to do with you. It's just my own personal opinion and something that was brought up during the Make Minot campaign that folks have been waiting for us to talk about publicly. So thank you, sir.
Thank you, Alderman Straight, and I'm sure we can further address these as they exceptionally expound on this on social media later. So, further discussion. Alderman Walski.
Mr. Mayor, I've got one more amendment to offer. This would be on page 20. I would move that we remove line 001-0600-491.34-12, as well as the line below that. That is the $750,000 from cash reserves and personnel savings, as well as cash reserves from recreation. Both of these are earmarked towards the City Hall retaining wall project. I would move that we remove those dollars from the 2020 budget.
We have a motion to remove 3 lines from the
Two
cash.
lines.
2 lines, I apologize. The 2 lines, cash reserve from personal savings from 2018 to City Hall, and the cash reserves, recreation at the City Hall retaining wall, $749,042, and $925,949, which would essentially eliminate the retaining wall project that was approved a few meetings prior.
Second.
We have a second by Alderman Straight. Discussion.
Mayor
Alderman Walski.
Mayor Sitma, thank you. Obviously, this has been a ongoing discussion, and at our previous meetings, what we were really approving was more an aesthetic budget item. It was at that meeting that one of the many red flags came to my attention. The first one is the fact that we have some extraordinary rising costs on this project. The initial estimates were at $2.7 million. Now we're at $4.7 million. So that by itself gets my attention. Our consultant's comments on those increases were time has passed, cost of things goes up. I can accept that. The cost of steel has been a significant factor in that increase in cost. That to me is a statement that suggests perhaps we need to evaluate options that do not include such dramatic amounts of steel. I would also share as another red flag on this particular project that it seems to me that the intent of the city has been very clear from the beginning. I'm going to read a quote from the engineering report that was delivered to the city back in February of 2016. This is a letter from Braun Intertech provided to KLJ, who is still today our consulting engineer on this project. At that time, the quote was, "We were informed that you plan to use a Ready Rock type MSE wall system to replace the existing retaining walls. The following report provides our recommendations for retaining wall structure support and construction considerations for the project." To me, that's a very telling statement. It suggests that we did not carefully look at all the alternatives for securing the slope stability. We looked at alternatives for building a wall. And I think it's a wrong way to begin a project where cost savings and the best decisions for the city are important. As a result of not reviewing alternatives at that time, we have a number of alternatives today that have still not been fully vetted. And so I think it's appropriate to stop this project and go back and take a look at the different alternatives that may be available to us for replacing and dealing with the rock face and stabilizing the rock slope underneath, the slope underneath, which at this particular point is believed to be stable. So so stabilizing is even a rough point. I'm also concerned about some statements that have been made regarding this particular project that I have found somewhat wanting for accuracy. At our August 19th meeting, Alderman Padragula and some of his due diligence and research conversations with the consultant was told, and that information was subsequently shared with council, and I have no doubt was influential in forming some of our opinions, but we were told that there was a 25 to 30-year pay for itself advantage on this particular project, essentially that the wall would pay for itself in that period of time. I dug into that statement a little bit more. What I found was that the better math on that turns that number to about 39 years, best case scenario. We also found that that assumption is that there is approximately $230,000 required to be spent every 5 years for that assumption, for this pay for itself in 39 years assumption to hold true. So I went back and I requested the amount of money we have spent on this wall, and Mr. Lakefield tasked some folks in Public Works for coming up with that. We got some numbers back. Going back to 1992, there was an allocation of about $6,000. In 2004, there was an allocation of about $50,000. And I think in 2016 or 17, there was another approximate $5,000 allocation. We've been told that this wall is, if we replaced it with an in-kind surface, we would have to begin spending $230,000 a year within approximately 10 years. But if we look at years 40 to roughly 65, we spent approximately $60,000 on maintaining the wall. So I'm just concerned that this particular project does not have a sound foundation of process underneath it. And I would like to slow it down. I would like to stop the design work. I would like to, frankly, hire Braun Intertech, our original geology consulting firm, to give us some estimates on alternatives. So that's why I proposed this motion, and we'll go from there.
Further discussion on the motion? Alderman Straight.
Mr. Mayor, I haven't liked this project since the beginning, and it's not because I don't think it's going to be a necessary or a deferred maintenance project that we have to address. I just think the timing of it, if, just to look at Mr. Ensling's comments from tonight, is sometimes we want things, but sometimes we can't pay for them. And this is one of those projects where I think that I don't think it's necessary right now. I think we could slow it down. I think the money is, it's critical that we do these projects right and that we have a little more trust from the public that we are spending their dollars correctly. And this is one where I think we're getting a very aesthetically very expensive wall that we could pare way back and have something far less. And so that's why I'm going to support Alderman Walsky tonight.
Further discussion? For anyone at home, there's been more than 3 hours of debate in totality on this issue at great length. I don't agree with the statements that we can wait. This has been well more than a decade in the making, and we have heard that from more than one structural engineer at this point. We do have a future use for our city hall, despite what some folks within the negatives within the community is that we would expect that our police department would utilize the space once vacated, and certainly the asset that exists here and both at the Minot Auditorium if we were to see a failure, which has also been a concern from the structural engineers. If anybody wants more of my comments, there's hours of it out there on YouTube. Alderman Pittner.
Thank you, Mayor Shipman. I just have to kind of echo Mayor's comments. This is the cost of doing business. This is maintenance, same as we as citizens do in our homes. And the longer we wait, the more expensive it becomes. We've seen that through this budget, through City Engineer Lance Meyer telling us that we had a pie in the sky, just like with our budgets over the past couple of years. We were lying to ourselves about the cost of doing business. We were putting items into sales tax when very volatile funding sources, and we have an opportunity to step up to the plate and take care of our assets. These are our assets. So I can't support the amendment. I think it's, again, it's something that has to be taken care of sooner rather than later.
Further discussion, Alderman Patagula.
I've been trying to bite my tongue because there'll be other things I want to weigh in on. I'm not going to support this amendment, but I think Josh is right in the sense of we limit ourselves, I think in this case limited ourselves too early to a replacement wall. I think it's justified at this point. You know, maybe 20 years ago it wasn't, or 15 or 5 years ago. So I'm going to oppose the amendment. But I think he is right, and I think we need to take seriously what he says about not limiting ourselves and not automatically going to a repeat of what we've had. That part I agree with, and I agree with very strongly. So I just wanted to explain that, because I think the tendency is to kind of go with what we've had before. And technology changes. When I read the report from Mr. Antman, our former city engineer from 28 years ago, he mentioned a technology I wasn't even aware of. I don't know if it's even around anymore. Things change, and I think we need to be open-minded about that, particularly with all the changes in the world, with all the changes in our environment, with increasing concern about various things. I like the idea, if it were feasible, which I don't think it is, but if it were feasible, I like the idea of natural grass is there. So, I want to, although I will be voting against this, I wanted to second Josh's notion that we need to not limit ourselves, not restrict ourselves when we're looking at significant expenditures and significant kind of improvements and things like that in the future.
Further discussion on the motion to amend.
Mr. Mayor, just to
Alderman Wolski.
briefly clarify my position, it is not my position that we should leave the wall unaddressed or unattended. There is a circumstance of deferred maintenance there that needs attention. I would remind the council that we already have a $1.4 million appropriation in the 2019 budget. Those dollars are being used to design right now. I think it's prudent to remove these dollars at this particular point because that sends the message that we can send this back to fully evaluate the alternatives. My expectation is that it wouldn't take very long to explore those costs and bring us a report that puts all the options on the table and allows us to see it and vet the project. If we got to the point there where the wall was by far the best option, this project would have my support. And I would even support it and offer it as a budget amendment at that time. But without that information to look at and without that information to show the public, I can't support the project.
Alderman Wolski, we have done that once already and voted. Further discussion. Further discussion. Please call on the roll to, or on the vote to amend.
Wolski?
Yes.
Sitma?
No.
Janser?
No.
Olson?
No.
Pittner?
No.
Padragula?
No.
Straight?
Yes.
Motion fails. Further discussion on the motion before us for the 2020 budget. Any further discussion? Last time. Further discussion. Please call the roll.
Janser?
Yes.
Olson?
Yes.
Pittner?
Yes.
Padragula?
Yes.
Straight?
Yes.
Wolski?
No.
Sitma?
Yes. Motion is approved. That takes us to 4.2. I apologize, 4.3, the public hearing of a demolition order for 512 8th Street Northeast. This is a public hearing to allow an opportunity for the property owner or neighbors to voice their opinions on the demolition of 512 8th Street Northeast. This order does not require City Council approval. However, providing a public hearing does allow an opportunity for the property owner or the neighbors to voice their opinions. The demolition orders for this property have passed their administrative deadline, and the dangerous condition of the building exists, and the structure at 512 8th Street Northeast should be demolished per the prior determination of the building officials. There are a number of attachments for this evening. Again, this is an opportunity for anyone to come forward on the proposal that is before on the demolition order of 512 8th Street Northeast. If you do, I would just ask that you say your name and also address for the record. Last time. Opportunity to speak on the item before us. And I believe we do not need an approval on this public hearing for action, or I would look to our city attorney.
Mr. Mayor, there's no need for an actual approval, but the motion is just, or the recommendation was just to allow the building official to move forward. for
Okay.
his recommendation.
All right. With that taken care of, then I would move, we do need to close the public hearing, though.
Make a
Alderman
motion that
Pittner.
we close the public hearing and move the item forward.
Motion by Alderman Pittner. Is there a second?
Second.
Second by Alderman Janser. Any discussion from the council on the motion? Alderman Patagula.
I'm really glad we're taking aggressive action in terms of this property. I feel obligated, as some of my brothers on the council have been earlier, to point out for the benefit of the public that we've been trying to deal with this for 8 years. And as the documents indicate, there is, quote, no response from the owner since 2011, close quote. I think there are several properties like this in the community that we need to be aggressive about. I wasn't even aware of this one. I can't call it a zombie home because, to be honest with you, I don't think any self-respecting zombie would live there. So I think there are properties like this, and I think we really need to get serious. And I'm getting increasingly frustrated with being told, well, you can't do it that way, and property rights or state law or whatever. People put a lot of time and money into keeping up their homes well. And if we have something like this, it's a cancer. And we can't let other people's property be devalued, and the community, the beauty of the community and the welfare of the community, the safety of the community be devalued by houses like this. So I'm going to be, every time this comes up, I'm going to be raising the issue, and I really would ask staff at some point to look at how we can manage these kinds of nuisances more effectively. It just boggles the mind to think that because we don't get a response from the owner that our hands are tied for 8 years. If you look at the pictures of this residence, whatever it is now, I guess it's a residence for cats and raccoons at this point, I think you'll see how inappropriate it is, even if we have 1 or 2 properties like this going on. And I really commend the staff for finally doing something about this one, but I really would like us to systematically look at this issue.
Thank you, Alderman Patagula. I will also include some updated details on our progress with the derelict homes and zombie homes that John is finalizing for me at our next city council meeting. That is substantially good news in regards to that. Further discussion. Alderman Walski.
Mayor Sitma, thanks. I greatly appreciate Alderman Padragula's comments, and this is, if there are a clearer case for this use, I can't see one. This is, based on the pictures I looked at, absolutely needs the attention and this action. I would suggest that as we get to that point where we look at evaluating our system and perhaps updating our ordinances to make things more easily, I would say it's maybe just as often that I see a circumstance like this where I catch an article where there has been overreach by a city government, right, and a taking that wasn't warranted. And so I think this is an important discussion, and I look forward to having it so that we can strike the right balance. But I think we're well on the right side of this one.
Very good point, Alderman Walski. Further discussion. Further discussion. Please call the roll.
Pittner,
Yes.
Padragula,
Yes.
Straight,
Yes.
Wolski,
Yes.
Sitma,
Yes.
Janser,
Yes.
Olson.
Yes.
Motion is approved. That takes us to 4.4 on our agenda, the Visit Minot Magic Fund Agreement. Visit Minot has submitted an application to receive $300,000 from the Magic Fund to develop an initiative and initiate a citywide marketing campaign. At the April 26, 2019 Magic Fund Screening Committee meeting, the screening committee recommended to approve the application and funding towards the project. Visit Minot then proceeded with the RFQ process, selected a consultant, and developed an agreement with the consultant. Visit Minot and the city then negotiated the attached Magic Fund grant agreement relating to this project. The 2 recommendations are to consider the recommendation from the Magic Fund Screening Committee, which was approved to the Visit Minot Magic Fund grant for $300,000, which will be used to develop a citywide marketing campaign. If the City Council adopts the Magic Fund Screening Committee's recommendation, it is recommended that the City Council approve the Magic Fund grant agreement and authorize the mayor to sign it on the city's behalf.
Move approval.
Motion by Alderman Olson to approve.
Second.
Second by Alderman Janser. Discussion on the motion. Alderman Straight.
Thank you, Mayor. I just wanted to point out that there's been an awful lot of work that's gone into this from staff standpoint and also from Visit Minot. I appreciate Ryan being in chat. I believe I saw you in the back. Thanks for being here tonight. I know the legal morass that we get into with these projects, I'm going to point it out again. I apologize, Ms. Hendershot, for calling it a morass, but we spend an awful lot of time and taxpayer dollars on back and forth legal discussion, and I know we have to protect the public interest, but this project for me, much like the Souris Basin project, I just worry sometimes that we are our own worst enemy within government, and we're slow, and we have to figure out a way to get better at that. So I'm supportive of this. I'm sure you all will be as well, but we have to get better at picking up our pace on some of these projects. This is long overdue.
Alderman Straight, it was somewhat interesting, too, that part of our discussion with the consultant on the economic development side, I think the term that was used was it liaison, or was it a chauffeur of sorts?
Concierge.
Concierge, that some cities, let's say on the higher end, use for their economic developers to get processes from the start end through the system. And that was a point that we had also made with this upcoming position, is the concierge, so to speak, or let's say navigator, would be, I think, as these two examples, to streamline. So I do appreciate the comments, and certainly it is a point that there's always room for improvement. We're looking for that, and I expect that we will. Alderman, I think I saw Padragula's hand up first.
Thank you, Mayor. A couple comments on this. I intend to support it, but the first comment I think is more on the line of educating the public, as my brothers have done before on other issues. This is part of the change in direction the city is taking in terms of economic development. We're going to be spending money on marketing and branding, and I think that's an appropriate thing. But that's different from how we spent our money in the past in terms of trying to attract big new businesses to town. But that is a significant change, and I personally support it. I think it's a good change. Last time around, we altered our efforts, or expanded our efforts, really, I guess, in terms of setting up that revolving loan fund, giving it some basic seed money, which I think was a very important thing. So we're looking at growing our own businesses, growing our own entrepreneurs, and supporting them. And this is part of that. But it is a significant change, and I think people need to be aware of that change. The second comment I'd make would be directed toward the advertising agents and the other people who will be involved in this. I guess I just want to caution that this isn't an ad campaign, and I'm sure you're aware of that. You're professionals in the marketing field. But I think some of the language that's used in that field can be a little harsh, can be a little grating to some individuals, and it sounds like it's the similar language is used when you try to sell soap or cars or whatever. And I think economic development and government-funded activities are different in kind from that. And again, I trust your professionalism in developing a good branding, a good marketing campaign, but I would just encourage you to be mindful of the unique characteristics of taxpayer-supported programs and to be very accountable. And in connection with that, I was glad that it may have taken another month, but I was glad that we developed more specific parameters in terms of, outcome measures, who's responsible for what, and things like that. I know each field has its own vocabulary, but I want to be very candid that I'm not a fan of that. But that's the reality. That's the language that marketing people use. So I just would ask in return for that support, mindfulness of the special characteristics of public governments, and just be respectful of the taxpayers' money, and see that maybe there's a higher purpose here than just making a dollar for the organization that's funding this effort.
Alderman Wolski.
Mayor Sitma, I have a question for you. I've heard twice tonight you've mentioned an economic development consultant. I'm not familiar with who that might be. So I was just curious as to what consultant we've been working with.
I'll turn to the city manager for the full details here.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Alderman Wolski, it's a good question. We have been working with a recruiter. That's who we mean when we refer to the economic development specialist or administrator recruiter. He specializes in hard-to-fill positions. You folks had approved that contract some weeks ago. And he has come to visit with the city and a number of different organizations to evaluate what our needs are, to ensure that he matches what our needs are with the best possible candidate credentials that can work for us. So that's simply, I think, what the mayor is referring to.
Thank you for that correction as well.
One follow-up here, and kind of a question for likely our city manager, our city attorney. But as you guys reviewed the contract on this, and this, a little bit of back and forth, did this look pretty good at the start? Were there some changes requested? If so, what would be the highlights of the concerns that got your attention initially?
Mr. Mayor and Alderman Wolski, I received the first draft of the Magic Fund agreement on August 27th this year. And I got comments back to the attorney for Visit Minot later the next week, I believe it was. And the main comments that I had were just making sure that all of the elements that are required as Magic Fund, as a part of the Magic Fund guidelines, were incorporated into the agreement. One of the big things that we had to incorporate were the measurable outcomes and the performance standards. And those are a section of the contract now.
Follow-up maybe for our city manager, but the performance standards and the measurables, these are, did these go through a vetting process, or did we kind of take what was offered?
Mr. Mayor and Alderman Wolski, we usually try to incorporate the organization in the development of the performance measures. It's important that the city doesn't set measures or metrics or targets that can't be achieved by the organization. And so it's important that we sit with them and evaluate what data do they have, what kind of goals and measurables can they achieve. In this case, we did that process and evaluated what was available, what was timely, at what frequencies were we going to measure data, and at what periods were we going to report on data to evaluate compliance against the contract. So yes, all of that's been done.
Mm-hmm. Further discussion? My short comment on this in my support of the Magic Fund application is this is, to me, a bigger piece than just economic development, but also an image piece that we're sending out to not only Minot, not only to North Dakota, but to the rest of the world, that we are a business-friendly community and that we're also inviting people to move to Minot. We have a 2.1 unemployment rate, and selling our community to those who might be looking for somewhere to move for a great job is an important piece, as some others in the state have jumped out of the starting gates well ahead of us. But to me, this is a significant piece of what we need in our community to continue moving forward. Alderman Olson.
Mr. Mayor, I was on the selection committee, and I just have to report that after all of the applications had been submitted and the committee had done their interviews and we had chosen the agency that would be representing us, there was such a sense of excitement and a sense of community that we don't always see or hear. And so I think as this rolls forward, our residents are going to sense that as well. And so, yes, we are reaching out to people who aren't in Minot, but I think that we're also taking care of those that do live in Minot, and it will just kind of encourage that sense of community.
Thank you. Further discussion? Further discussion? Please call the roll.
Olson?
Yes.
Pittner?
Yes.
Padragula?
Yes.
Straight?
Yes.
Wolski?
Yes.
Sitma?
Yes.
Janser?
Yes.
Motion is approved. That takes us to number 5, personal appearances. This is an opportunity for anyone in the audience to come forward on any issue that is not on our agenda. An opportunity to bring an issue before the council or an opinion, for that matter, on any item that is not on our agenda. Again, this is number 5, personal appearances, an opportunity to speak on any item that is not before us this evening. Seeing none, we'll move on to the miscellaneous and discussion items. This is an update on the expiring land lease with Minot Aviation. There was an attachment on here as well. And if you would, please come forward and your name, address, or association for the record, please. Can you check to see if the green light is on the microphone for me, Bob? Right on the base of it.
There we go.
Okay, thank you.
How's that?
Perfect.
Good evening, Mayor Sitma, members of the council. I'm Bob Martin. I'm an attorney in Minot. I represent Ava and Stuart Lucky and Minot Aviation and the Airport Hobby Shop. We appeared before you, I believe it was on August 6th, with respect to the city's decision at that time taken to terminate the current lease on the property. I promise I won't be as long this time. I didn't even ask for any extra time from Mayor Sitma. Essentially, the attachment that was presented to you consists of some email strings between myself and the Assistant City Attorney regarding, I guess, the direction that I was hoping to take with this. The highlighted paragraph from Ms. Stahlheim indicates, I do recall Alderman Padragula expressing a desire for staff to work with Minot Aviation to comply with the FAA regulations and renegotiate a lease, but that request was not made in the form of a motion. And a lease, like any contract, requires a meeting of the minds, and one mind's going this way and one's mind's going this way. I completely understand the city's concern, as expressed by Mayor Sitma, of making sure that there's no impact on FAA funding for the airport by this operation. By the same token, if we can come into compliance with the FAA, we're still talking about a building on the property that the city owns. The city does not own the building. Ava Lucky owns the building, and it's a considerable value. And if we can work out a negotiated lease between all parties that complies with FAA, whatever operation is going on in this building, pays the city your franchise lease agreement, as you indicated earlier, you thought the lease term for the land lease was too low, even though it is just the land lease, not the building itself, and allow them to continue to do business as they have been for the past 37 years, I think that's a win-win for everybody. So what I'm here to do tonight is to seek the motion, I guess to go back to Alderman Padragula, a desire for staff to work with Minot Aviation to comply with the FAA regulations and renegotiate a lease. That's the motion I would like for the council. I would add that the city attorney's office, Ms. Hendershot and Ms. Stahlheim, have been very helpful in forwarding information to me. They've provided me with FAA regulations that they feel are appropriate, as well as the contact information from Mark Holzer, who is the FAA Regional Director in Bismarck, and Nicole Harris in Minneapolis, who's the General State Director for Airport Operations. I do have calls out to both of them seeking contact information and some clarification on some definitional issues, but they have not yet responded. But that's where we are. I'm not saying I'm being stonewalled, but I think we're operating on two different lines. I'd like to see if we can't get together. If we can't get the FAA's blessing on the operation, Ava has indicated that she's willing to close the hobby shop and move operations. The operation that we would then contemplate, if the FAA authorizes this, we then have a building that's being used to store functioning airplanes, as we saw last time from the video, as well as service those airplanes, and also for the use of development of experimental aircraft parts, which I think clearly is aeronautical or aviation related. Thank you. I stand ready for any questions if you have any.
Thank you, Mr. Martin. Any questions at this time? Thank you, sir. If you would stay closer, did you have a question? If not, Mr. Martin, if you would just hang close, we'll ask Mrs. Stahlheim to come forward with some items as well here.
So, Mayor, members of the council, Derek, I think I prepared a slide here. There it is. That I literally copy-pasted the motion from the minutes that were taken. And so that's what's before the council here today. And it states that Alderman Pipner moved the City Council to adopt the recommendation of the Airport Director not to renew or extend Minot Aviation's current land lease, which expires on January 31st, 2020, and direct the Airport Director to move forward with all actions necessary to wind up the present lease with Minot Aviation. The motion was then seconded by Alderman Straight, and the roll call vote on that motion was unanimous. My intention moving forward with this particular action was not to stonewall, to use Attorney Martin's words. It's more so to follow the direction of the council and wrap up this current lease. If Mr. Martin's clients do present a land lease opportunity that's compliant with the FAA, we'll of course present it to the council for your consideration, along with any other lease opportunities that may be available from any other entities as well. And it'll be for the council to consider what use is the best and most reasonable use of that property at that particular time.
Thank you, Ms. Stahlheim. Are there any questions for Assistant City Attorney? Alderman Pittner.
Just curious how that, or thank you, Mayor. Just curious how that works with Ms. Ava Lucky owning the building but leasing the land. When that wraps up, how does, just for clarification for the council and maybe the public watching, how does that work when that lease expires?
So when the lease expires, we'd have to determine how that relationship's going to continue. Is Ms. Lucky going to move her building? Is there going to be a purchase of the building by the city or some other entity? Our negotiations haven't progressed that far yet, but it's something that will have to be vetted. And to my knowledge, correct me if I'm wrong, Attorney Martin, that hasn't been discussed between us.
No, there was one part of the email string, excuse me.
Thank you. If you could step to the microphone.
Sorry about that. Used to wearing a mic for court. There was one portion of the email string where I indicated that if the city attorney's office or the city was aware of anyone who was interested in purchasing this, if there'd been any type of discussions not on the record, that they should contact me with that respect. But as I said, when I look at the highlighted portion of the email that's before the city, I left that last council meeting feeling that we had reached an accommodation, that we were going to be working towards something, but now apparently we're not. If there is going to be like an open leasing consideration, we'd also like to be informed of any deadlines for submitting proposals, that type of thing, because the building is worth, at one estimate, almost $300,000, and that represents my client's, Ava Lucky's, essentially her retirement money, her life savings, and we simply just can't walk away from it. I don't want to get us into the morass that was earlier mentioned. People sometimes have a feeling that lawyers have to run to court and make life difficult. I don't. I just like to try to solve problems, and if we can come to a win-win for everybody, believe me, I'm perfectly okay with that.
Thank you, Mr. Martin. And Alderman Patagula.
Asking our Assistant City Attorney, would it be fair to say that the wheels of maybe not justice, but deal-making are moving a little bit here? I mean, is there a process where we're trying to work these things out?
There's certainly, my office is always available to discuss this particular lease. Like I mentioned, to my knowledge, we haven't received any business proposals to lease this particular property yet from neither from Mr. Martin's clients or from anybody else for this particular matter. So we simply don't have any information to forward to you at this particular time. Correct me if I'm wrong, Attorney Martin, but your client's position right now is they would like an FAA compliant lease that allows them to continue to lease their present site and continue to maintain their current operations at that present site at the present rental rate. Is that correct?
No, not at the present rental rate. That was of a concern to the council, I believe, that the rental rate was low for a commercial activity. That's why I requested copies of franchise leases from the city attorney's office. It's not our intention to just continue a status quo ante. We want to try to come into compliance with the FAA to make sure the city is protected in its airport operations at the same time that my clients can maintain their businesses in the locale they've been at for 37 years, successful businesses generating revenue for them and in tax revenue for the city, and also as part of a franchise lease as well.
And so to that end, if I may, Mayor.
Please continue.
Mayor, members of the council, we have not received any information from Attorney Martin that indicates that they're changing the operations of their actual business. And as you'll recall, at the August 5th meeting, there was a question raised during the inspection by Director Feltner as to whether or not the activities that they're conducting on that site are aeronautical related. So that's a factual dispute that can be sorted out here between the parties. Again, to my knowledge, we haven't received any indication that they're changing the actual business model unless that's changed from our last communications. Attorney Martin.
As I said, I'm in contact with both of the FAA agents that the city provided, the city attorney's office provided contact information for. I need to settle in my mind the definitional aspect of this, what constitutes aviation-related activity. To my mind, a building that houses functioning airplanes, services those airplanes, and is engaged in the manufacturing of experimental airplane parts is aviation related. I guess maybe I'm being simplistic. God knows I've been accused of that before. But as I said, once I get the definitional aspect of this settled, so I know what exactly I'm calling an apple is an apple and not an orange, then I will definitely approach the city. But as I said, if I can get the FAA to tell me that someone who's operating drones or selling drones and radio-controlled aircraft and involved in those type of programming, if it's a possibility of getting some type of waiver, then no, we don't want to change the business model. But if that waiver isn't possible, Ms. Lucky has stated she will move her operation. So the operation left behind at the hangar, as I said, storing functioning airplanes, as we all saw, servicing those planes, manufacturing experimental airplane parts. I'd have a hard time believing the FAA is not going to consider that to be aviation related.
And Mr. Martin, I would believe that would have to be brought forward to the city staff to evaluate. If they're talking about a change, we need to see things in writing to be brought forward with that potential. We have our deadlines to follow within the given motion that was passed, and also with our compliance issues, as Mr. Feldner had pointed out in this last meeting. So moving forward, that January 31st, 2020 is the deadline for this current. I would expect to have further communication between you and the city attorney on what your findings are with the FAA and any potential change that would exist then moving forward for a potential future lease if a different business model is identified, unless the FAA comes back with some waivers. And I'm not about to second guess what the FAA has in mind or become a mind reader for them by any means.
That's exactly what I was looking for. It just seemed to me that line from maybe it was a presentation thing, maybe I'm reading too much into it, but you can read the paragraph for yourself in the email string. It's a highlighted paragraph. It sounded a bit like a door shutting.
For the current contract, or for the current lease, it is. Absolutely it is. But if you're bringing forward something different, something that, one, we can find compliant and that business model fits, that would be considered a new lease. So perspective may be everything on this one, but the current lease, it is a door shutting, but there is the opportunity for a new lease if it is
I
compliant.
understand that the council took the action to elect not to renew the lease, and you've taken that position. You made that abundantly clear. I'm not trying to revive the old lease. What I'm trying to do is keep my clients in the same spot they've been for the last 37 years, doing the jobs that they love.
Okay, I would expect the conversation then to continue for either a new lease or communication otherwise from the FAA. I think Alderman Wolski had a question.
Mr. Mayor, just some general comments that I've kind of picked up.
Do we have any questions for either attorneys here before?
They're kind of directed, I think, at likely both attorneys
Okay.
in some respects. So if there's a reply, that may be appropriate that they stay there. But, two things that I've heard tonight that I think need to be established are deadlines. What deadlines exist? What opportunities should the new lease arrangement be offered to Mr. Martin and his client or anybody else in general? So the sooner we can establish timelines on any formal steps that are happening, I would hope we can do that and communicate that to Mr. Martin. And then aviation-related activity. I know it was gone over significantly at the first meeting, but if there's anything we can do to help Mr. Martin establish what, and from my perspective, I feel like it's the FAA that defines what aviation-related activity is, but it sounds like you're having some trouble getting there. Perhaps we, the city, in our institutional pull can help find the true definition or the way the FAA is going to help us prescribe that. If that's already there, then please point it out. But these are just the two things that I've heard that might help move the process along a little bit. And
So, and Alderman Wolski, members of the council, to that regard, I have forwarded Mr. Martin, or Attorney Martin, a copy of the Federal Aviation Administration's policy on the non-aeronautical use of airport hangars. And within that guidance, it discusses when airport sponsors, such as the Minot Airport, can lease space to somebody for a non-aeronautical activity. It's very, very limited. It does discuss what aeronautical uses for hangars are considered underneath that policy and the approval process for the same. So I forwarded that guidance to Attorney Martin on multiple occasions, and it was also included with the initial notices that we sent out to each of the parties with these airport leases as an attachment, so they would all have access to that policy.
And I believe I earlier acknowledged that I did receive the copy of the regs.
Further questions? Thank you. That takes us on to 6.2 on our agenda for this evening. This is the gathering space. There is a document attached as well for anyone who might be following either in the audience or at home. Alderman Walsky, you are the one who had asked that this be on the agenda.
I was. Thank you, Mayor. In essence, I see a project that is in distress, and what I've offered here is the framework of what I think is a life raft. But I'll share the general framework that's attached in the memo. This was written a couple weeks ago by me, so there's a good refresher for myself. But ultimately, I'm very concerned about the project in part because of a number of unanswered questions that remain. We have an uncertain footprint, we have an uncertain design, we have uncertain partners, unknown operational aspects. We have concerns about the budget, whether it's in total the amount required to fulfill the vision that was put forth. I think we have some council actions that have thus far been predicated on funding fears and concerns of timelines. I think that's been an element. And as a final part, I feel like over the last 6 months, I have observed the public attitude toward this project take a dramatic turn for the worse. On the whole, these circumstances are, I do not believe, the foundation on which a successful project is built. I think typically we see projects become imagined, they become located, they become designed, they become funded, and then they become built. And we don't seem to have an answer to hardly any of those questions, other than we want to stay within the somewhat ambiguous guidelines provided by HUD. And I understand our desire to do that, obviously $6 million, and not having to dip into our own treasury to accomplish this is a significant incentive to operate within those rails. But so as a life raft, if you will, what I have offered here are some things that I think will get this on the right track. And one of them is that we make a commitment to site number 2. And my reasons are in part due to the public input, in part due to the public response since we chose that location 18 months ago. The second part is that rather than try and fit a project that fits HUD guidelines, let's design a project and develop a project that we want to build. Let's take a look at this site and put the design together. And I would suggest doing this independent of NDR funding. And I think there are a number of concerns outlined, or a number of items outlined in the memo. Obviously, we want to ensure public safety from the traffic and railroad. We want to minimize acquisitions and acquisition costs. A point here that I think is very relevant to some of the recent discussions is we want to maximize property redevelopment opportunities and property tax revenue growth. And I have concerns about that particular item in some of the concepts that have been talked about. So I want to design the project. I want us to figure out what it is that we want to accomplish. Once we finish that, I also want to do, in parallel, I want us to figure out how this place is going to operate. One of the recurring public concerns I hear is, what is it going to cost to run it and who's going to pay for it? And obviously the public is concerned that there is a property tax liability that's going to exist here. I don't have any way to speak against that particular point because we don't have a feasibility study. We don't know how it's going to be operated. All we know is that we're going to operate it and we're going to have some partners, but we haven't even formalized who those partners are. So there's, from my perspective, there are some very significant unanswered questions regarding the operational feasibility. So once we know what we want, once we know how we are going to operate it, then I think the final step is we need to figure out how to fund it. And I think there are, if we go through this process, we are going to absolutely find parts where the NDR program fits very perfectly, but it might not fit every part. And so when those circumstances are identified, then we get to work figuring out how to address those particular shortfalls and put the tools in place that allow us to realize the project that we want to accomplish. So that's the essence of this memo. We obviously have a deadline approaching here at the end of the month. And my concern in allowing this to slip any further is that we, the council, may become somewhat entrapped by our self-imposed deadline, frankly. So my hope is to bring this up for discussion today and see what the council's will is, because I'm, frankly, from this seat, from this perspective, this project is not going as well as I want it to go, and I'm concerned that we aren't going to realize its full potential.
Further discussion. Alderman Pittner.
Thank you, Mayor. I wanted to thank Alderman Wolski for his introduction to this memo. I think it really speaks to his passion for this project, and it's a project that I believe could be a crown jewel of our community and possibly the state. However, I just can't get on board with the proposal in front of us. In regards to an item, a list of issues that I see within this memo. In regards to the public input process, I personally question how true and unbiased the online polls were in identifying site number 2. It was the only site that had its own marketing campaign associated with it. When it comes to the private investment cited in this memo, that has occurred in and around site number 2, and someone can correct me if I'm wrong, but to my understanding that the process that we as a city agreed to was to do our due diligence to make site number 2 work, the highest rated and reviewed site, and if the properties were unable to be acquired, the city would move to the second highest rated location. Therefore, any investment made by the private sector was speculative at that point. And I don't believe it's the role of this governing body to make anyone's private investment whole. The tail is wagging the dog if we start to do things like this. I also personally believe that it would be morally questionable to do so in this situation. In regards to the bait and switch perspective that the community would have, that we're going to move from this location to another, I honestly don't see it. Where I do see a bait and switch perception is the fact that we conveyed to the public that this project would be completed with the majority of NDR funds, and now we're sitting here with a proposal in front of us talking about using taxpayer dollars to move this project along, all because we're not getting what we want. Rather than adhering to what the city said we would do, not only to HUD, but also to the citizens. I think that is by definition a bait and switch. I can't support the idea of using taxpayer dollars to move this project along. We sat in this room a year ago, tightening up our purse strings, trying to protect and use dollars wisely, and now we're going back on our word, what we say we were going to do with those dollars and how this project was going to come to fruition. I honestly believe that since this idea of gathering space in downtown Minot was conceived through the NDR application, and that we are looking to remove the NDR aspect possibly with this proposal, that we need to take a step back to the very start of the process and review the project in its entirety. And from some of the public sentiment that has been perceived as negative over the last few months, I think that speaks to it even further, that we need to take a step back. And with some of the information, in regards to the information that was brought to light from our mayor earlier today, I think a step back is more warranted now than ever.
Alderman Jensen.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I essentially concur with the comments that Alderman Pittner made. I think this council made a decision to move the deadline date from the end of August back to the end of September for negotiations on the properties that are subject to this second site, site number 2. And I think that we are subverting that process by taking this matter up tonight and not seeing the negotiations to conclusion. And I think we all know that there's a possibility that the property owners will not be willing to sell for what they're offered. And then we will have a choice of what we want to do. And it may be to continue this quest with the NDR money, or it may be to try to divert those dollars to some other purpose. and maybe continue at Site 2 with some other approach. Or maybe that is something that private development and private entrepreneurs will decide to do anyway. But because of that, I move that we table this discussion until after the end of September.
We have motion to table discussion on this until after our deadline.
Second.
Second by Alderman Olson. Discussion on the motion to table.
It's not discussable, I don't think.
I think you are right, Ms. Alderman Wolski. On the motion to table, I don't know if there is or not. I'm going to look to our city attorney. No, it's not. All right. Please call the roll, Kelly. Motion to table.
Point of clarification?
Yes.
What did Alderman Wolski ask? I didn't hear it.
I'm sorry, it was Alderman Janser that made the motion to table discussion until after our deadline on the NDR.
Okay, well, I have further discussion, I guess.
We have a motion to table. It supersedes.
That was my clarification, Alderman Straight, is a motion to table is not a debatable motion.
Gotta love Robert's Rules of Orders. Please call the roll.
Janser,
Yes.
Olson,
Yes.
Pittner,
Yes.
Padragula,
No.
Straight,
No.
Wolski,
No.
Sitma.
Yes. Motion approved. That takes us to 6.3. And for the public, that item or discussion can continue after the deadline of September 30th, if I'm remembering the exact date correctly.
Excuse me, 6.3?
6.3 is that regarding 6.2.
Okay.
6.3 is the acquisition policy and
Yes.
value guidelines, and that's guidance, and that is our next item on the agenda, and that we look to Alderman Wolski as well, who had submitted for discussion.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Mayor. I was concerned that that item was also attached to the previous motion to table, so and that wasn't what I had voted on.
No.
So.
Please continue.
Yes, so this is, I would say, directly tied to elements of the gathering space conversation that have been brought to light in recent months. But I think it's appropriate for the city to take up the question of whether we need an overarching acquisition policy for the city. And as part of that, I would like to inform some of the values that might go into that discussion. But the circumstances that bring this discussion item forward are, one, in at least one case, the city informed a property owner within the gathering space footprint of an acquisition procedure that the city then did not follow. And so here's the specific example. One letter sent to property owners contained the following. Once the environmental review is completed, an appraisal will be undertaken by the city and an initial offer will be made for not less than the appraised value. It is my understanding that that is in fact not what happened. We offered this letter to the property owners within the footprint, and then between the time of this letter and the time of the initial offer, the process by which value was established was changed. And that leads to point 2, which is the use of assessed value versus appraised value as a valuation methodology used by the city in determining values and presenting offers to property owners within the gathering space footprint is inconsistent with longstanding and successful acquisition practices. We've heard a number of times how the city is very much on the right side of HUD's good graces with regards to our acquisition practices in our involuntary program associated with flood protection. That particular process starts every single time with an appraisal. We've heard Mr. Zakian share that HUD requires that we establish a valuation methodology, and I accept that. I obviously understand and appreciate that we have to do that, but I'm a little concerned in the respect that we had a long-standing successful practice that HUD is very, very happy with in terms of how we've been procuring properties through involuntary acquisition, yet in this circumstance we used a different methodology. And so while that's standard, that methodology may be acceptable to HUD, it is not acceptable to me. And so one of the actions that I would seek as a result of this discussion is that the city administration develop an overarching property acquisition policy independent of NDR activities that, at the very least, contains the intent of the following clause, which is, when seeking to acquire real property, the use of local, state, with the use of local, state, or federal dollars, the city shall first conduct an appraisal. I feel like that's a very sound starting point for the taxpayers and for anybody who might be on the other end of one of those letters when the city sends out saying, we'd like to buy your property. I think an appraisal is absolutely the proper pathway to take up here. As a second part, and this is a discussion that we have teased at times in the past. It came up briefly during our council retreat, the first part of August, but we take up discussion on the following organizational values. And obviously this strategic planning process we know is going to take quite some time, but there are three values that I think are important in how the city conducts business. One is integrity. When we say we're going to do something, I want us to be able to follow through on that particular statement. I'm not sure that we have met the bar that I would have us meet in terms of integrity on this project, because we did tell property owners in the initial offer of letter of intent expression that we were going to start this process with an appraisal. That changed over the course of this process. We also have issues of consistency and fairness, which I think play into this same conversation. We have, in some cases, citizens accessing NDR dollars through acquisitions mere blocks away with remarkably similar properties that are being treated very differently by the city in terms of an acquisition policy. And so these are the larger discussions. In short, I mean, this is a long way of saying I'm not particularly happy how we've gone about our business with acquisitions in the gathering space. And I see these inconsistencies. I see this fundamental unfairness. I see us saying one thing and doing another. And that's not something I can abide, so I had to bring it to the council's attention.
Alderman Straight.
Mr. Mayor, I'm going to either read the statement I had prepared for the previous item, which also entails this, or I'm going to just cut to the chase and be extremely blunt. How would you like to proceed?
It's your turn at the microphone.
All right, I'm gonna go at it from a positive standpoint before I get into some heavier topics, I guess. Mr. Mayor, City Manager, and colleagues, I believe HUD wants us to be successful. We are the shining example, as we have heard. However, to make Mr. Walski's point in the memo, we have a problem with this gathering space project. The problem entails public trust, confidence in us as a body, and with city staff currently. And unfortunately, there's a bit of a PR misinformation, and the facts that are being discussed in the public by residents are less than true sometimes. It's absolutely critical we get this right, and we be respectful and reflective in the moment. The NDR is one positive out of 2011. It's controversial as well. $74.3 million is one-time opportunity for our entire community. The gathering space is but one component. It's a burden. You could view it that way. However, you look at it. We have great progress on some other NDR aspects, on the homeless shelter, Park South, to name a couple. Still, we have been at this project for 3.5 years. To be clear, I've heard and I take the public sentiment seriously. Not everyone wants a park. Not everyone wants a gathering space. However, we were granted $6 million for this project. That's why it's so important. We keep our community vibrant and inclusive to all. But let's not forget the conversations that persisted throughout the 80s, the 90s, and 2000s about the brain drain and what was happening. People were leaving this community. And what do we have to do to keep this vibrant and dynamic? That's why I'm so passionate about it now. I wanted to take the emotion out of this, but when the brain drain in the 80s, 90s, 2000, it was all about people leaving for better opportunities. Now we have a talent drain. We've even heard our city manager express this in how we retain staff. We're losing people to Fargo, Grand Forks, Bismarck. However, the positive is the average age being 36 years old. Minot Public Schools has an uptick. You look at the recent upgrades at MSU, the zoo, the Children's Museum, all of that came from our city community facilities funds. There's a transition at the mall. You look at the IEDC gaps, we've had organizations, I mentioned earlier, Visit Minot, Service Basin Planning Council stepping up, the interest buy-down program, not to mention the strategic plan that you've mentioned earlier tonight. However, as it pertains to the gathering space, we have had huge missteps, and I'm going to own some of my own here tonight in the conversation because I think it's incredibly important as we move forward. We have to own our mistakes when we've made them, and I had the weekend to kind of reflect in preparation of this, and I think, man, I've dropped the ball. I have to apologize to the public. I have to apologize, I think, to city staff because I hold myself to a high standard, and I think, yeah, this is a good time to be reflective and talk about it. But I think if we talk about it from the context of the beginning of this project to the frustration the public's had to where we're at now to things that have been mentioned tonight, I'm going to start by one of Tom's first meetings talking about how Trinity was going to be the space. And so it's kind of bred into this conspiracy theorist mindset that we were going to go to Trinity all along. So I understand that. I just wanted to put it out there because then I can own my own. I've met with staff. I've met with previous staff. I met with public school officials and administration at Central Campus before we even had a fine understanding of what the details of this project were. And I feel I owe it to Minot Public Schools and to the administration there to say, I'm sorry. Former planning director, myself, I know some others, we have toured some of these buildings in Site 2 without probably knowing the action plan. However, we have then went into a public process to gather public input. We've gathered public input since the flood in Minot Riverfront and Center, the brownfields. We have not implemented a single aspect of any of these. And so to hear Alderman Pittner, I can understand there's questions with the Survey Monkey. The city chose that as the mechanism to gather input. So if we're now going to throw into question our own capacity of how we gather input, I think we also have to own that. You understand what I'm saying? Like, we're calling it into question all of a sudden, but then we're not owning the fact that it's our project. I represent city staff and the public, but I'm shocked sometimes that we make statements and we don't own it together. So now for the Survey Monkey to come into play, that this whole thing is rot, I think there's entirely a time for a reboot to this project because it's a once-in-a-lifetime shot of $74.3 million. And so, Mr. Mayor, I think as we move forward, I think that you should appoint a new liaison to this project because I don't think I have held up my end of the bargain, but I think that there is public trust about how we are going about this. And I don't, I take it in all seriousness, and I mean absolutely no disrespect, Mr. Zakian, but you've done a good job on some of the other projects, but I think, John, you have to step aside from this project. I think in order for us to gain public trust,
Alderman Straight, let's
need to consider
address in the order of which we address city staff. If we have a complaint against one of the directors, they're to be directed at our city manager.
Fair enough, sir, but I just think in terms of, I mean, no personal, I'm putting myself out there, sir, saying we need to reboot this. We need to start fresh. We need to gain public trust again, to Alderman Pittner's point. If we're going to do it, let's do it with a clean slate. That's all I mean, sir. I mean absolutely no disrespect. But I think that it's important that we recognize our place within the process. That's all I mean, sir. And that has to do with Alderman Walski's acquisitions. That's why I circle back to it at the end here.
I'm not sure if I agree with the mistakes in the totality. When we talk about mistakes, which are we specifically addressing here? And it's not so much as a question as when we met as a community to talk about the gathering space, the community itself identified 3 spaces. Now, I know there has been a significant emphasis on Site 2, and overall, yes, it was the the winning vote getter out of the SurveyMonkey. No question about that. I think the question is whether or not we as a council, we as a community are going to take a look at $6 million and shortchange it before we meet our own deadline. Shift because we may not agree, or at least some of us may not agree with the acquisition policy that the federal guidelines set for us within that, or whether or not we're going to look into our own coffers or our own taxpayers to say we need $6 million to go build a community facility. And by the way, we don't have enough to build flood control in its totality, and we have to go to the state legislature in a year and a half and ask for a low-interest, long-term loan because our tax dollars out of our sales tax don't stretch far enough. I'm not saying that I don't agree with a community gathering space. I have been a very strong advocate for getting a community gathering space in this community. I think it would be a tremendous asset for our community. I think that if we take $6 million and shift it into something else, we would have to look at what the P3 would look like, a public-private partnership or private investors, rather than coming back to the taxpayers again for something, as we just talked about. We may not be able to build everything we want. However, we may be able to entice somebody else to come in and build it. I am 100% confident that if we're going to stay on our acquisition policy that has been proven in court, and I think I could either call our tax assessor or our city manager to draw the breadths of those and send them out in emails for those cases that we were upheld in court on where our values were at. I think it's prudent for us to stay within the guidelines of what the federal acquisition policies are, what the state guidelines are, and what our own laws that we have when it comes to these acquisitions. Any deviation from that is opening Pandora's proverbial box, not only moving forward, but looking back as well, whether it be for the flood, the homes that we're going to need for flood control, or for any other acquisitions that may come up, and we don't have a crystal ball to figure out what those would be for any future endeavors. Any further discussion on this? Alderman Patagula.
I want to speak as a psychologist here. For once, this is starting to sound like a conflictual, perhaps dysfunctional family. And I'd like to, and then I say that seriously because I think the process of the council, this new council, has been excellent. Right now, I don't think it is, again, professionally speaking here. And I guess I want to make sure we don't escalate things and start using language and polarizing ourselves, without necessity. Maybe there is a polarization, maybe there isn't. I, for one, have not heard complaints. Now, maybe people don't come talk to me. I've not heard people getting vociferously upset about this project. So I also wonder, too, if there might not be some misunderstanding, if it might not have been an innocent mistake. That's always my default option. Maybe there's just a goof. I guess I've always thought that we used appraisals, and it sounds like we're using appraisals and assessments maybe interchangeably, and maybe some letter that went out just was an error. And so I think Josh is right. We need to clarify this. I'd like to see a policy. I think it also fits very nicely with what the city staff is doing at council's direction to try to have better policies regarding contracting and spending money. But I'm a little concerned about this thing starting to escalate, maybe unnecessarily, and conflict starting up where maybe there isn't any. So, I guess I would like a restatement of how we do this. Is it appraisal and is it an assessment? Is there much of a difference? I'm just a little cautious here because, I agree with you very much, Mayor, that, we've made a commitment to the community. We've made a commitment, to HUD. And, if we're starting to change our focus, our goals, that's a really big deal to me. And I'm not sure that I want to do that personally, and I'm not sure that we should be doing that. If we want to do that, that's a whole different kind of discussion, I think. I always thought we were, trying to make the best of this gathering space and trying to make the best of this particular location. And we have a couple more weeks, and when the deadline comes, and hopefully there'll be an agreement. But if there isn't, we kind of take another look at it. So I guess my counsel, as a clinician, is just let's kind of back off a little bit here and not make things more conflictual than they are. And I don't personally see them as conflictual. Again, maybe I'm blind, but I don't see them as conflictual. So I would just kind of caution us to, or encourage us to kind of chill out.
Is that billed by the hour, Dr. Potter?
That's pro bono work, pro bono.
Thank you. Alderman Olson, you had your hand
Well,
up for a comment.
I know that these two items are married, and I'm going to try to separate them out a little bit because we're kind of talking gathering space, which we really tabled, and we're talking about the acquisition policy. So I want to focus on the policy for just
Thank
a
you,
minute.
Alderman Olson.
And so in Alderman Walski's memo, it says that in at least one case, this policy was not followed. My first question would be, was it remedied? Was that mistake fixed? And what does our policy say? You know, was this just a one-time mistake, or do we have a policy that, you know, kind of spells this out more clearly?
Mr. Mayor, I think it's probably appropriate to call Mr. Zakian to the podium with your permission. And while he's approaching, let me just remind the council that if this sounds a little confusing, it's likely because it is. We actually have multiple policies depending upon the type of acquisition we're going through. The process that Alderman Wolski is talking about, the appraisal being the method by which we establish value, is true for involuntary acquisitions. It is not the case for voluntary acquisitions. The gathering space is a voluntary acquisition process, and the HUD rules do allow for assessed value to be used as an established value. For involuntary acquisitions, assessed value is not allowed to be used. So there's some confusion there, and Mr. Zakian, I think maybe you can add additional clarification with the mayor's permission.
Mr. Zakian.
Sure. It's peak of hay season, so the good news for you is I'll probably run out of voice, so I won't be talking very long. First of all, we do have policies for both voluntary and involuntary acquisition. The voluntary acquisition policy, the city instituted in 2012 and has been followed ever since. The policy for voluntary acquisition is using the city appraiser, city assessor, I'm sorry. Now you have me confused. City assessor, not independent appraisal. That is permitted under the law. Now I know this is, as Alderman Padragula noted aptly, this has churned up with a lot of discussion recently, and this may have been forgotten, but a lot of what I'm about to say, I've already said twice to you all. Once at the special city council meeting on August 12th, I believe it was, and once at one of the June council meetings. It does allow for voluntary acquisition for a city to either use city assessor or independent appraisal. We have been tracking on the involuntary side the independent appraisals against city assessor values that are used for tax purposes. This goes back multiple years. Their average deviation has been no more than either 5% above or 5% below. So what that means is that from an overall standpoint on the voluntary side, there really isn't an impact whether we use Kevin Turnus and his staff or we hire an independent appraiser. However, on the voluntary side, since we have the choice, and this dates back to 2012, remember that an appraisal costs money. And every time we have to do an appraisal, that takes money away from us, using it to help citizens in other ways through other projects. I would be standing before you here tonight if we didn't have to deal with the laws, recommending that if we were going to have a policy, that we always use the city assessor. Because over time, it would probably save us more than $1 million in appraisal costs that the city has incurred since it used the involuntary acquisition process. I do want to address, that's the overview. One thing just to clarify, and it answers Alderman Olson's question. On January 19, 2018, an informational letter, that's almost 2 years ago now, an informational letter was sent out to the property owners, Site 1, Site 2, Site 3. The purpose of that letter was only one thing, and that was what was stated in it. We wanted to know whether or not they were willing to sell their property or if they had interest in selling their property. We needed to do that in order to move forward with a substantial amendment that this entire council had asked us to move forward with, because we had to be able to tell HUD that the property owners in sites 1, 2, and 3 would in fact be willing to sell if we chose to go this route. And that was the basis, one of the primary bases on which we got the substantial amendment. In that letter, now remember, this is a year and a half ago, certainly a year before we actually were able to go to acquisitions, I did use the word appraisal because we were still trying to get clarification from HUD in between the end of 2017 and probably February of 2018. How this would form and what shape it would take and what rules would we have to live under. Now, I had always, you can go back and watch the YouTube sessions, I have repeatedly said from mid-2017 that I was very certain that we were going to have to use voluntary acquisition, that because of the nature of this project, we'd never be allowed to use involuntary acquisition. But when I sent this letter out, there was still a scintilla of doubt that we might be able to use involuntary acquisition. Now, to play it safe, since if we were to ultimately get a green light and I had come to you with a choice of either voluntary or involuntary, I couldn't say we were going to use a city assessor, because then that would automatically preclude us from using involuntary. So I used the word appraisal. Now, flash forward, on February 19th, 2019, HUD approved us going forward to make the offers. On February 20th, 2019, we made the offers to the property owners in Site 2. The reason we were able to do that is because we used the city assessor's value. If we had had to take the other course and use an independent appraiser, we would not have made an offer to any of the property owners, probably at earliest May, because as you know from our experience with involuntary acquisition, it takes us 3 to 4 months. There was a complete sense of urgency, understandable on the part of this council, to move this project forward. There was also a clearly expressed desire on the part of this entire city council that we minimize costs that would be taken away from actual investment in the construction of a gathering space. And for those reasons, plus we had the opportunity that since it was voluntary acquisition, and because of the historic record that the city assessor has been spot on in terms of establishing values versus independent appraiser use, we chose to go the voluntary acquisition route, which had historically since 2012 been using the city assessor. I think that addresses the issue.
Thank you, John. Any specific questions regarding the acquisition policy or guidelines that Mr. Zakian has outlined?
Yes.
Alderman Walski.
Mr. Zakian, I went looking for our involuntary policy or our standard policy. I couldn't find it, so I would appreciate you sending me the city's standing acquisition policy, the one that suggests that policy starts with an assessed value as opposed to an appraised value, because that's frankly directly what's in question here, and I would suggest that that isn't good enough for me. So I want to see that policy, and that's what's been proposed as a change of that policy, as well as an overarching policy that says we shall start with an appraisal, because so that's the specific request from John, is to see that policy.
Mayor Sitmer, Alderman Walski, I'll send all of you both our involuntary acquisition policies and procedures and our voluntary acquisition policies and procedures.
Further questions from Mr. Zakian? Alderman Patagula.
Just to clarify, John, with the gathering space, we are using HUD funding, and we have decided, or at least are following HUD's guidelines or whatever. The net result is that we regard these only and solely as voluntary acquisitions. Am I correct in that understanding?
Mayor Sitmer, Alderman Patagula, yes.
And secondly, then, our policy has been, whether it's clarified or not, apparently, is that we use city assessments for that because they track appraisals so closely and save us a ton of money. Am I correct in that?
Mayor Sitmer, Alderman Patagula, yes.
Thank you.
Alderman Wolski.
Follow-up question. John, do you have a sense of how many times over the past, since you've been here, where we have used an acquisition policy independent of the involuntary program? Or have we acquired any properties outside of the involuntary program?
Are you talking about eminent domain?
I'm talking about city acquisitions. I guess I'm just trying to think out loud here a little bit. Maybe the landfill project. We acquired land there that was outside of, we might have even had NDR dollars attached to that. I'm not even sure.
That was State Health Department grant dollars,
but-
and that was, I think, negotiation for voluntary.
So that's the question, is I'm trying to get a sense of how many of these acquisitions, because we've got a massive track record with the involuntary program, hundreds of acquisitions. Probably fewer with involuntary acquisitions and commercial properties. They're probably the large minority in the many number of acquisitions we've taken or we've undertaken. That's obviously a much more challenging property valuation because it's oftentimes dependent on what type of lease is in the building, and there's many more factors. Residential valuations, I think, are considerably complicated. I would guess if we called Mr. Turnus up, he would share that. But just those are a couple of things that I would like, just a sense of how many outside of NDR we have acquired and used.
Mr. Mayor.
Yes, Alderman Olson.
Early on, for several years, I chaired the Appeals Buyout Committee, and as that process started, those were voluntary buyouts, and we did use the assessor's value of those homes to determine the amount that would be offered to the property owner. I don't know the number. It was several, but again, that was 7 or 8 years ago probably, but we certainly started out with voluntary acquisitions.
I believe I said on the appeals process for that as well for a full year for the
Yes.
voluntary acquisitions and the assessed value too was.
And that was, by that point, it was involuntary, but as we started the process, it was voluntary.
If I might, Mr. Zakian, those would have all fallen under federal acquisition guidelines because if I'm not mistaken, we were using CDBG dollars for those acquisitions, potentially with some state matching from the State Health Department as well.
Yes.
Okay. Further questions for Mr. Zakian? Thank you, John. Further discussion before us tonight on 6.3 on the acquisition policy and value guidance.
Mr. Sitmo.
Yes, Alderman Wolski.
Just one final closing thought. I feel like I have understood what has taken place prior to the gathering space. I have understood, I think, what John has explained to us several times in the past. What I'm suggesting in this particular memo is that the standard we used for the gathering space was not a high enough standard for me. And so obviously, if the city changes the policy, that is a council discussion and a council decision. And so that's why I brought this forward, is because I believe we need a solid policy that we can rely on that is above and beyond the standard, frankly, of what the federal government may or may not allow. Because obviously we end up in situations like this where there are concerns about the practice we went through. And yes, it probably would have cost us a little more on the front end to conduct the appraisals. But if it had taken us to a place where the acquisition negotiations had gone much smoother, I can see it having saved us a whole lot of time and expense and public trust as well. So there's always the two sides of these arguments in terms of, we took the shortcut early, but did it cost us more in the long run? And I frankly think that might be what we're looking at here. So.
City manager, and then I'll come to Alderman Potagula, and we'll wrap this.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Alderman Wolski, I detect your frustration, and it's been detectable for some time, and I apologize for that. The city didn't change the policy. The policy's existed, as you've heard, since 2012. If it doesn't meet your muster, I apologize. It is the policy that has existed since 2012. I think this idea that the city has intentionally made the acquisition of this project or property more difficult is absurd, and I can't tell you how many countless hours we have spent on this project trying to make it work.
Mr. Barry, that was not the suggestion of any of these agenda items. It just, in point of fact, was not. If the policy has existed since 2012, I understand and appreciate that, and that's why this agenda item is here tonight, so we can take this up as a discussion and potentially change it. Again, I am not attempting to tie this to the way the gathering space has gone. It is inevitably and intrinsically tied because it is the example that has brought us here. But for this particular agenda item, like I said, I think this is a issue that is important to me. It is a policy issue, which I think is the direct domain of the council. And I'm not prepared to offer this as a motion tonight because I wanted to get the general sense of the council. It's there as a discussion item, but I think in the future, I will offer this as a policy change item. I do want to see the current policy because I have gone looking for it. I just went looking for it on the CDBG site, and I couldn't find it. And we have a number of other policies listed there. And so that's, again, all of this is coming to a head. It's difficult that it is frustrating, hard stuff that we're going through, but this is the tool that I have. I have policy choices that I can offer to the council and to the community. So,
Alderman Padragula, and let's wrap this up with new information, if we could.
I don't want to make things conflictual or contribute in any fashion toward that. You know, I think I understand the policy. I think it would take city staff, 3 of them, 5 minutes to put it in writing, so I would understand it. But and I guess I'm not sure that, again, I want to ask this of Alderman Walsky, but, you know, he said that he wants accountability, and I agree with him almost always that that's an important thing. And I guess, and again, this is where I'm hesitant, what would be the higher standard of accountability? I mean, I think today I've become reasonably aware of what the rules have been and are. Maybe they weren't disseminated adequately. Maybe, you know, but I guess what would be that higher standard?
Alderman Walsky.
Sure. The higher standard is third party and outside the umbrella and domain of the city. That is what the private independent appraisal offers to us in this situation. And it divorces us from these potentially ugly ideas that have come out, like conspiracy and things like that. Whereas if this project had started independent with an outside appraisal from the beginning, we wouldn't be having these conversations because they would be going through the same track that our many, many successful involuntary acquisitions have gone through. And so that speaks to trust. That speaks to fundamental fairness. Again, when we have one particular acquisition policy acquiring a property that is very similar to another acquisition policy, and the dollars that are arrived at are somewhat different. Even though they're a few blocks apart, they differ by a few thousand square feet. But so I think there's a fundamental fairness question here again. Whereas you have one citizen in town being treated differently by the city than another citizen in town, and I frankly that is not acceptable to me. And so that's why this has been offered as a particular solution, a policy solution.
So clearly, we do have some heavy opinions on this and have been on this for a little while, and clearly we are going to be on this again down the road. Mm-hmm. In substance. If anybody has any remaining marks, let's keep it under a minute and we're going to move on. Alderman Straight.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I reached out earlier today to Mr. Mahalik, just out of curiosity, if he would consider chairing a committee if this thing got rebooted. In my comments earlier, I talked about the positive aspects of NDR, in particular the homeless shelter. And so, John, I meant absolutely no disrespect, but I think in terms of this project where John and I are linked, I think a reboot is in order. And that's why I made the statement I made. But I think that's up to you and your leadership, Mr. Mayor. But increasingly, I can't be a part of the conversation as it's been, whether it's the buyout or now the discussion about SurveyMonkey. And I'm just increasingly uncomfortable. And if I can't adequately stand up and defend staff in their words, then I'm doing you, the community, an absolute disservice, sir. So I've gotten there. If you can convince me otherwise that we're, I'm going to leave that in your court to Mr. Barry's frustration. Yeah, this is the world we live in. We spend a lot of time advocating for the city and defending city staff, and the decisions that are made and words that are spoken, and, we have to have thick skin in this job. I'm just trying to figure out a way to move forward.
Alderman Bittner.
Thank you, Mayor. I just wanted to maybe voice my experience with appraisals versus assessors. Even an appraisal isn't going to warrant necessarily the results. Alderman Olson and I sat on the buyout, and we had individuals bring an appraisal from Minneapolis, Minnesota for a property that the city had assessed, or appraised, from a local real appraiser, a North Dakota appraiser. I mean, this is such a, and they may never admit to this, but an appraisal versus a refinancing appraisal or a purchasing appraisal, they're all looked at in different lights. So I don't think this is just a quick fix, like Alderman Wolski might suggest, that this would just immediately provide some sort of desirable outcome. Just my thoughts on it and with my experience with appraisals.
Final closing thoughts, Alderman Pontegoula, and we'll move on. Oh, I'm sorry, Alderman Olson.
Yes.
Sorry.
I think the proof is in the pudding that we met for about 5 years, every month, with a full agenda of people that were opposing appraisals. It cost them additional money, it cost them time, it cost the city time. So people were not satisfied with an appraisal any more than an assessment.
And with that, we're going to move on to our next agenda item and continue this clearly in the future. This is our department reports, and our fire chief has been waiting very patiently in the back room. Good evening, Chief Kelly.
Mr. Mayor, members of council, good evening. I need a, is this the clicker? Is that a hold on I heard from the back?
How are we doing back there, Derek?
Turn it on. Sheesh. I don't. Yikes.
We'll have the man from behind the curtain step out and fix it.
Sorry.
The wizard.
For the sake of getting out of here, use this.
Okay, hang on. Okay, just making sure it works. So tonight, I worked on this project and decided to do an overview of 4 very important projects that we've been working on this last year. Thanks to you and your support and continued support, we were able to do some very important things for our department. First and foremost, we changed over our incident reporting software this last year. We changed from kind of an antiquated incident reporting software, and we were able to move into a new incident reporting software called Emergency Reporting. This one has a lot of different aspects to it that we've been able to work with over this last year. Obviously, it has incident reporting, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But it also goes into our training records, and all this plays into ISO. It'll play into accreditation and data-driven decision-making for us. So in the training records, it allows us to track the training, set up JPRs, which are job performance requirements, to ensure that all of our expectations are met. Asset management, that is something that we've been working on for the last 3 years. We have a lot of equipment. We have a lot of different types of equipment, facilities, as well as our fleet. And so we've been able to really dive into that, get all of our inventories, put together replacement schedules, and ensure that we have good budgeting practices in the future. Truck checks, our personnel are using tablets for their truck checks. It works right into here. So we're keeping track of all of our inventories and our truck checks on that, as well as putting in work orders just right on the tablets. Hydrants, they're called water hydrants. We have a little discussion going in the background on that. But our fire hydrants are also put into this software, and we're able to keep track of the flows that we do, our inspections, which again is for ISO and for our water department to be able to utilize also, and our personnel. For the occupancy module, we are doing pre-plans and we're putting in all of our inspections, our annual inspections all go in there. This is just a one-stop shop for our entire operation, so it's really aided us this year. Our online reporting, or our online library, we've put in all of our SOPs, we've put in training documents, which we can then follow up and hold people accountable for making sure that they're getting their training done and logged, as well as putting in our calendar and events logs, because we're trying to track as many contacts with our citizens as we can. A couple screenshots that I took is the mapping, which we were very excited about. So this is a map of Minot, and it has the little blue dots on there that has how many incidences in that area. And then when we zoom in, we can see the red triangles are fires. The green dots are other. It could be a spill, or it could be lots of different things. And the blue kind of star is a medical call. So that's what we can kind of dive in and be able to see where our responses are and what types. This is another type of mapping. It's called heat mapping. It is not a plume of a hazardous materials spill or anything like that, but the red indicates that we have a lot of calls. So the downtown area has a lot of calls in that condensed area, and you can kind of see where it's flowed throughout the community. So we're very excited about that. It allows me to see when I pull up a map, I can kind of see, and then I dive into the data a little bit more and kind of look into some calls. There was one out in Surrey that I saw one morning. I went, why did we go out to Surrey? But we went out on there on a mutual aid call, so. This reporting and analytics, I am extremely excited about. The one on the left dives into an NFPA 1710. This is, if we're compliant, this is only for fires right now. If we're compliant in our turnout times, minimum staffing, which we put in 3, we can change the parameters, and a turnout time of 4 minutes. And this is how we fared for that time frame. So the green is the compliance incidents, and the red is our non-compliance incidences. For our standard, our NFPA standard, they ask for 90% compliance. So as you see in April, we were close. We look at for about 70 is what I would like to see us at, so we're working on it. And all of those marks have to be met. Blah. If you don't meet the turnout time of 1:20, it won't go into the green. So every parameter has to be met. So we're looking through that. We're working through the different options. There's ones for EMS, but I just wanted to kind of give you an idea of what we're looking at. The one on the right is a 1500 NFPA standard compliance, which is our health and wellness compliance, which looks at a lot of different areas. It'll look at our facilities, staffing, our medical protocols, our wellness protocols. It looks at training, PPE if it's compliant, a lot of different things that all go into that NFPA standard compliance. So we're working with the analytics. We're getting the data in as fast as we can and trying to see what we can get out of it. We like these dashboards. The facilities plan also plays into the last piece. We've done a lot of different upgrades throughout the last couple of years, and we thank you so much for your assistance in that and your support. Station 3 obviously being the biggest one. Your budget priority is that we maintain our facilities before we add new. So we knew with Station 5 being on the horizon, we really wanted to focus on getting our upgrades done, which was paint, some carpet, and then right now we're working on those replacement schedules, so we know that we're gonna need carpet at Station 1 in the next 10 years again. So we're kind of working through those, even those building components. This, unfortunately, is one of our sad projects that we have to talk about. This is reality for us. We have active shooter emergencies that we may have to respond to. My colleagues and I around North Dakota, as well as the nation, when we've talked about active shooter, we've kind of stepped back. That's a law enforcement issue. But in reality, it overwhelms any service. So right now, we've put together a plan for active shooter, and we're working through our protocols. Ward County Emergency Management is bringing in a top-notch trainer, actually, in October that will train up some of our personnel, law enforcement, as well as community ambulance, which will then train the rest of the providers. And then we will be working through our protocols with the police department to ensure that we're all on the same page. Fire takes a more active role than community ambulance would. Community ambulance would be staying in the cold zone per se. Fire goes into the warm zone. So once law enforcement goes in and knows where the shooter is and allows us to come in, then we'll be coming in to take the people out that are injured. We are going to be looking at a grant or some kind of funding to get the ballistic gear for our personnel, to put them in a position where they have the right protective gear when they're going into this. But this is something that we're working through, and it's sad that our society has brought us to that. The next piece is something that's taken us quite a while to work through, but we did an operational planning session. So this is our vision and strategy development that we did. We worked with EAPC and their business development group to be able to facilitate our planning sessions. So this is our execution cycle. We did have our mission already established. We did that right when I got here. We created a new mission statement. We also had our values that we already had created, and that was who we are and what we stood for. We then created a vision with EAPC and with our group, and that's what we're striving to become, and I will share with you our new vision. We created goals, what we're going to look like when we arrive. We developed strategies to meet those goals, and we've broken down our action plans to be able to help us execute them and to be able to bring us into the future. We're also going to create plans for reinforcement and revisions of those plans if we need to. So this was our process. It actually started in January. We did an employee engagement study, and I will share some of that with you. It's actually very interesting. February, we then gathered the team. We had 17 personnel on the team, and that was comprised of all ranks and all personnel, the different positions within the ranks. Together, we created a picture of what our desired state looked like. We identified current gaps of our future state, and then we grouped the gaps into strategies to achieve that vision. We then brought in another group. That was 19 of them, again, all different ranks, and we sought feedback on our vision that we had created and to see if we met the mark at all, as well as for them to look at our strategies. And once they met, we reconvened our group later in March to modify the plan with the feedback that we received and assemble our teams and assign owners for reinforcement. So this is our new vision. So we will demonstrate our pride, dedication, and commitment to each other and the community by, geez, I can't see, it's covered up. Developing and refining our skills to strengthen the department and thus better serve the community. And above all, we will care. That is the biggest thing. So this is some of the employee engagement results, and we're actually very excited about these results because it really gave us insight into our personnel. And this was again done in February. So the different colors, it's less than 1 year of service, greater than 10 years of service, 1 to 5, and then 5 to 10. So I want to point out the key driver, that is the highest one. I want to read you a couple of the questions that were asked in that one. Overall, I am satisfied working for this organization. I would recommend this organization as a great place to work. I would like to be working for this organization in 5 years. And I am proud to work for this organization. And that is the highest one. And I think that says a lot for you as a council, as well as our team as an organization for the city. That is huge for our retention. So we were very excited about that. So the development covered opportunity and growth. That's our training program. You supported us hiring a training officer. Thank you very much for that. Motivation to perform, that's empowerment, decision-making, resources available and held accountable. Communication is feedback, open to input, leadership that listens and considers feedback. And I will send this out to you guys. I will give it to Derek so he can send it out, and so you can dive into it a little further if you'd like. The two that are highlighted, we're actually going to dive into a little bit. So quality and safety results. The biggest question was staffing levels. You guys know all about that. I mean, it is what it is. And we are back up with staffing. We're down just a couple right now, but we're going to be going through a hiring process here in a couple weeks, and we'll be getting back our staffing level. The second one is belief in leadership. And our focus group actually was questioned on the term leader. What do they mean by leader? And leader was said to be their immediate supervisor. So it could have been their captain, could have been their battalion chief, could have been me or the assistant chief. So the belief in leadership was a little low for 5 to 10 years. But when you look at our organization, we are very young. Even our leaders are. We had all brand new battalion chiefs, 7 new captains. We are very young, just overall. And so these numbers don't scare me at all, but what it does is it reinforces the fact that we need to work through officer development to gain that trust and get those numbers up for us. The greatest survey differences for our staff versus leaders was as shown, but I wanted to highlight the green one. I'd like to be working for this organization in 5 years. For our staff, which is our firefighters, 90%, and leaders, 81%. That is awesome. Trust and respect, I feel like I can trust what my leader tells me. We need to work on trust, as well as a clear understanding of how our organization is performing. I need to do a better job of getting those performance metrics out there so we know how we're performing, and that emergency reporting is really going to help me in that. Gaps in our vision, lowest scores. I just highlighted the top. That one was glaring. It's staffing levels. So it'll be interesting when we repeat this to see if that number should be up, because we've been working very hard on staffing levels. So these are our 4 strategies that we came up with: becoming proactive and progressive, intentionally connect with the community, recruit and retain talent, and strengthen department culture. And these are designed to be completed within 3 to 5 years, and we've created different groups that are going to be working on each of these strategies to develop action plans for them. So that's kind of where we're at. When we have it all put together, we will be getting you a copy of our plan, and so you can dive into it and ask questions as needed. So this is a little bit deeper dive into those 4 strategies. I know we've been here a long time tonight, so I won't get into them, but we do have measures of success. For example, becoming proactive and progressive. Measures of success, we're going to be going through the accreditation book, see how we are and best practices compared to others. ISO evaluation, I'd love to see us moving to a class 1. Increasing our pre-planning as well as community risk reduction. So the implementation process, we have our team that completed their action plans with due dates. We're setting regular reporting schedule for their strategy progression, identify escalation path if the team gets stuck, and then we also have a communication plan, identify appropriate audience, and setting a cycle to keep momentum for years to come. So our future works in progress. We are preparing for accreditation. Team and I are heading to Williston actually next week, and we are going to be diving into the accreditation book and getting some advice from the group that does the accreditation to see if this is for us and how we can pare it down a little bit so it's not so big. It just seems very big right now. We are continuing to collaborate with community partners, especially Trinity Health, their community ambulance. We've been starting our Cardiac Ready Community. We are involved in Safe Kids Coalition, which is just starting up. We are doing community risk assessments where we're going to assign risk numbers to each facility in town, and then we can dive in and see where our target hazards really are. Our standard of coverage document, where it dives into our response And we'll be able to do more of that once emergency reporting is up and running a little bit more, and succession planning. In a year and a half, unfortunately, we have some more leaders that are going to be retiring, so we're ensuring that we have personnel that are ready for that next step within their career. And that is my report.
Thank you, Chief. Any questions this evening, Alderman Straight?
Thank you, Mayor. Chief, I just want to start off, sometimes when we have these long meetings, I'm sure
Yes.
staff has a desire to go home early, but
Yeah, they told me 3 slides only, so.
yeah, but I want you to know that the public pays attention to these, the people that watch online, and I never want you to feel like you have to cut, or anyone in any department, because the information is important for the public. So with that, I'm curious, Chief, discussions within internal departments, like the garbage crew goes out. I'm thinking of your attendance at an Eastwood Park meeting that I attended a few years ago. We had a obstacle of getting a fire truck in because of a residential apartment that came to be after the flood, and it shouldn't have been because of zoning. I would love to hear, as the community assessment risks come to be, other discussions within departments of where we might have issues. I think that would be healthy, because I think the public would love to see our police department, our fire department, even our sanitation department participate in some of those community neighborhood meetings. And I'd just be curious to hear what some of that what might come out of it, because I think it's healthy for not just assessing our risks, but also better just being vocal and out in the public. So I just wanted to say, don't cut your presentation short, but it's important stuff.
Thank you.
Further questions for Chief Kelly this evening? Yes, Alderman Wolski.
Brief comment, Mr. Mayor. Chief, I love what the software and the reporting software is allowing us to start to look at. I feel like these are the cornerstones of good decisions and getting a sense of where we're strong and where we're weak. And I think the staff survey that you've conducted is right on target in terms of trying to identify where the department's healthy and where we need to apply a little extra work and grease in some form. So I appreciate the presentation. I appreciate you taking your time to go through it, and I appreciate the work that's being done.
Thank you.
Alderman Padragula.
Very strong compliments. I think the process you're describing in terms of strategic planning is one that the City Council could very well adopt, and we've talked about that a little bit in our retreat meeting, and what you've done in your department provides a very good template for us to probably follow. I have a lot of questions. I'm reminded of one of my favorite movies, The Day the Earth Stood Still, the first one, where the professor, Sam Jaffe, meets the spaceman, and his eyes are wide open, and he says, "I have so many questions." So in the interest of saving time, I will make an appointment to meet with you and your staff and spend a day going over this and getting access to the data and the dashboards. I'm very impressed with what you're describing, and I think this could be a good model for other parts of the city, including the council. So I thank you very strongly and your staff, and I have so many questions, and I'll find another place and time to ask them.
Thank you.
Chief, about the only thing that your presentation didn't have on there was kind of what Alderman Straight was talking about, was the community sentiment. Rarely do I ever hear of complaints, other than maybe a siren or two that's a little loud at the early morning hours, but rarely do I ever hear of complaints about the fire department or even the police department. I think the firefighters, I said the word right, firefighters, are very well respected in our community, and I think that shows up through the ranks from the youngest rookies into where our leadership is at. So please pass that along, and we're very appreciative of all that they do for the community and the parts that they play within the community, because they're also residents of Minot and family members as well. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
With that, we move to liaison reports. We're not at the 3-hour mark yet, so Alderman Pittner.
Make it quick. Most of the boards that I sit on are meeting later this week, so I have no report.
Okay. Alderman Chancer.
None of my groups have met.
Alderman Wolski.
Also quick, seems to August is a month to take off, but Wednesday morning, zoning and planning getting together again every 2 weeks. That one comes around. Really valuable, meaty policy discussions taking place, so please join us.
About how long do those run?
We can pretty reliably be there from 8 a.m. to 10 every other Wednesday.
Thank you. Alderman Straight.
Mr. Mayor, I'm excited to report another positive thing that it's my understanding we approved the first interest buy-down program through Souris Basin Planning Council. As you recall, that money came from the Magic Fund, and there's possibly 3, if not 4 more applications possibly in the pipeline. So that money's going right to work, and I think that's exciting news, sir.
Fantastic. We'll look for follow-ups on that down the road. Thank you. Alderman Olson.
Mr. Mayor, I did attend the Census Count Committee meeting last Friday. We are still gearing up for that April 1st count, and just can't stress how important it is that we get all of our residents counted. We're certainly looking to make it to that 50,000 mark because it'll benefit our community, certainly. Aside from that, we want to know who lives in our city. We want to know the diversity that's here. We want to know what our culture is. So we certainly encourage everyone to be counted. There will be an online process for counting this year, which should make it easier for our residents. But if people don't partake in that, we are in the process of hiring enumerators or door knockers, counters, who will go around as well. So if there are people that are interested in that, they're taking applications now. I think jobs will be offered in early December. And I also met with you and the city manager, with the Baker Tilly representative, who was just looking for some input on some of the requirements and some of our wants for the economic development administrator.
And we're looking for an information push coming soon, I believe, on the census, correct?
Yes.
Okay. That should be going out to the public. I think I saw that.
Yes.
Okay, just trying to refresh my memory here. Alderman Patagula.
Like several other people have said, the committees I'm assigned to, the groups I'm assigned to, haven't been meeting, and I want to apologize for not delivering my 17-item memo about the asset management software to the council president and the city manager. I have been inundated. As most of you know, I do a lot of legal work, and I've had something like 15 hearings to prepare to testify at this past couple months. The latest file I finished reviewing was 3,300 pages of records. So that's been my life lately. So sorry about that, but I haven't forgotten about it, and I will send it, because that's going to be a really big deal, this software package we're going to buy, and it's going to open up even greater opportunities than what the chief has spoken about in her department with their asset management and record-keeping system. This is going to be a big deal.
All right. The only other piece that I would push forward is we are coming up to the North Coast Fest right around the corner, and we do have a delegation coming in from Norway. They will be here. That we are planning a gathering for some of the different folks, and we will be pushing that out to the council for an invitation here in the near future to get together and meet with those folks that are coming over here and talk about some of the different opportunities and some of the adventures that they're looking, and I say adventures in a good way, not only with the North Coast Fest, but to see the things that are going on in and around Minot and a little bit beyond. So we're very much looking forward to that. Alderman Walski.
Mayor Sitma, I just wanted to kind of chime in on the census conversation. You know, we're coming up on probably 6 or 7 months here, something like that. But I feel like it takes, 37 times you hear something before you acknowledge that it's you're aware of it in some form. So for over the next 6 months, maybe the more times we say census, the better. Maybe every 2 weeks there's, certainly an update as often as that committee meets, but this is just a topic to stay very, very vocal about and present about.
I couldn't agree more. Beyond that, get out to the North Coast Fest. We do have a special city council meeting that Monday. Put that on your calendar. Other than that, we have run out of things to talk about tonight. We're almost 3 hours in. We are on to item number 9, which is adjournment. Motion by Alderman Pittner.
Second.
Second by Alderman Olson. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed, same sign. We're adjourned.